Cade Vylorn opened his eyes a split second before the priest touched his forehead with the awakening crystal. The hall at the Verholm Academy buzzed with hundreds of voices. Cade stood in line with the other teenagers, staring at his hands. Thin fingers, slender wrists. This body had been his for 16 years, yet sometimes he still marveled at it. The crystal flashed. Light ran across his skin and gathered in his chest as a warm knot. A silver inscription unfurled above Cade's head. Talent, Fortification. Rank, none. Works only on inanimate objects. The hall fell silent for a single heartbeat. Then someone laughed. The laughter spread. The priest lowered the crystal and looked at Cade with weary pity. He said that such a talent appeared once in a generation and that its bearers usually ended their lives repairing fences. Cade silently stepped down from the platform. He didn't flinch or blush. He was thinking, reinforcing inanimate objects. Something inside him responded to those words with calm confidence. In his past life, he had known the value of durable things. That knowledge lay in his memory like a tool in a box, waiting for its moment. Next, Cedric Land stepped onto the platform. Crystal shot a pillar of crimson flame all the way to the ceiling. Talent, flaming blade, high rank. The hall erupted in applause. Cedric's eyes found Cade's, and he smirked. He said loudly that now it was clear who would be cleaning the stables, while real warriors defended the kingdom. Cade didn't reply. He had already tested his talent. He placed his palm on the wooden railing of the staircase and reached toward the warm knot in his chest. Power flowed into the wood. The railing darkened almost imperceptibly and grew denser. Cade tapped it with his knuckles. The sound was hollow and heavy, like that of an oak, even though the railing was made of pine. The expenditure of power was minimal. The knot in his chest had barely dimmed. Cade took note of this. An hour later, the assignment to combat teams began. Instructor Garrick Vane stood before the formation and read out the names. A veteran of 3 border wars, his face a mix of scars and stone. He shouted out a name and assigned a squad. Cedric Land was assigned to the first squad. He was paired with the best healers and shield bearers. The formation thinned out. Cade stood there until the very end. Herrick rolled up the list and looked at it the way one looks at a cracked sword. He said that a combat team needed someone who killed monsters, not someone who polished walls. He said that there was a special assignment for Cade. The border settlement of Turnholm on the northern frontier. The position was defender of the settlement. The garrison consisted of 1 man, Cade himself. The ranks erupted in laughter. Someone shouted that Turnholm was a hole even the rats had fled. Garrick raised his hand and the laughter died down. He added that, according to the regulations, every settlement was required to have a defender with an awakened talent, and that the law didn't specify exactly which one. He handed Cade a travel permit and a copper defender's token. Cade took both. He looked the instructor in the eye and said he accepted the assignment. Garrick held his gaze for a second. Something about this boy's calmness struck a chord with him. Usually, those who were expelled cried or begged. This one looked as if he'd gotten exactly what he wanted. That evening, Cade was packing his things in the barracks. His bunkmates avoided him as if he were contagious. Only the fat clerk from the office lingered nearby and whispered that no one had gone to Turnholm of their own free will for 5 years. He said the last defender had fled from there last winter, and before him, 2 had died. He said smoke had been seen beyond the northern ridge this year, and that the old rangers were talking about activity in the wastes. Cade thanked him and continued packing his bag. Inside went a change of clothes, a whetstone, and 3 books from the academic shop. Fundamentals of Fortification, Properties of Building Materials, Chronicles of the Sieges of Northern Fortresses. The shopkeeper had sold them for a copper coin because no one had asked for any of them in 10 years. In the morning, Cade walked out through the academy gates. No one saw him off. A supply wagon bound for the north was waiting at the gates. The driver glanced at the defender's badge and silently nodded toward the straw in the bed of the wagon. The wagon set off. The academy faded into the distance, along with the laughter and Cedric's crimson flame. Cade lay on the straw and stared at the gray sky. He placed his palm on the side of the wagon and channeled a drop of power into the plank. The plank hardened. He did this with each plank in turn throughout the 6-day journey, watching as the knot in his chest depleted and replenished itself. By the 3rd day, the knot had grown noticeably larger. His talent grew with use, just like a muscle. No one at the academy had bothered to test this. On the 7th day, the road turned into 2 ruts in the withered grass. Ahead, lopsided roofs came into view. 3 dozen houses. A rotten stockade, chest high, with gaps large enough for a cow to pass through. A crooked watchtower, leaning as if drunk. Beyond the settlement, the gray wastelands stretched all the way to the horizon. The driver stopped the wagon and said he wouldn't go any further for any amount of money. He dumped the sacks of grain right on the ground and turned the horses around. Cade remained standing on the road. A gray-haired man emerged from the nearest house with an axe tucked into his belt and looked at the copper token. Then at the thin young man. Then back at the token. He asked who had been sent this time. Cade gave his name and described his talents. The gray-haired man was silent for a long time. Then he said his name was Bram, and that he was the only one left here who still remembered how to handle a weapon. He said the academy had apparently decided to bury the settlement for good, since they'd sent someone to reinforce the fences. Cade looked past him at the holes in the palisade, then at the dark line of the northern range. A thin wisp of smoke rose above the ridge into the evening sky. Cade asked how long the smoke had been there. Bram turned around and his expression changed. He said there had been no smoke that morning. Cade picked up his bag and walked toward the palisade. He said he'd start with the gate. At the ceremony, Cade received the despised talent Fortification, which works only on inanimate objects, and was expelled from the combat teams by instructor Garrick. He was sent as the sole defender to the dying border settlement of Turnholm near the wastelands, where the veteran Bram lives. Cade discovered that the talent grew stronger with use, and new smoke appeared over the northern ridge. Cade started with the gate because the gate is always the weakest point. The gate panels hung on a single hinge and were nailed together from rough-hewn timber. He ran his hand over the wood and felt the dust crumble beneath his fingers. In his past life, he'd been able to detect voids in concrete just by the sound of tapping. That skill hadn't gone anywhere. He tapped each board and mentally noted all the rotten spots. Then he placed both palms on the door panel and channeled his power into it. The wood darkened and tightened. The cracks closed. The fibers compacted so tightly that the plank rang like iron beneath his knuckles. The knot in his chest eased by a third. Cade sat down on the ground and waited for his energy to recover, counting the minutes. 40 minutes, a third of his reserve. Slowly, but he had nothing but time. Bram watched from a distance, chewing on a straw. That evening, he walked over and kicked the reinforced panel with his boot. The panel didn't even budge, but Bram hissed and clutched his leg. He looked at Cade in a new light, not with respect, but with bewilderment. The way you look at a dog that suddenly started talking. He said that in 5 years, not a single defender had laid a finger on the palisade, and that they all spent their days drinking at the only tavern. Cade replied that he didn't know how to drink, but he knew how to build walls. The next 4 days merged into a single stretch of work. Cade walked around the palisade in a circle, reinforcing post after post. He hauled stones from the river and filled in the gaps with them, then forced the stones together into a monolith. He ate what old Martha, the tavern owner, brought him and slept for 5 hours. The knot in his chest grew from the strain, and by the 4th day it was healing twice as fast. The residents watched from their windows. At first they laughed. Then they stopped. The sullen blacksmith Dolan came out on the third day, silently placed a bundle of iron staples next to Cade, and just as silently walked away. On the fifth night, the first guests arrived from the wastelands. Cade woke to a howl, not a wolf's. Lower and more muffled. He ran up to the fortified watchtower and saw 6 creatures in the moonlight. Scavengers from the wastelands. Bare, gray bodies on 4 legs. Muzzles like snarling skulls. Bram followed him up with his crossbow and cursed. He said the scavengers hadn't approached the settlement in 3 years, and that they were always fleeing from something bigger. The creatures crashed into the palisade, where there had been a hole a week earlier. Now there was a stone there. Claws scraped against the monolith. And at that moment, a silver inscription unfolded before Cade's eyes, one that only he could see. The talent recorded the parried attack. The wall held. The defender was awarded 1 point of resilience. Cade froze. He opened the talent's inner vision. Next to the power node, a second scale now glowed. Resilience. 1. The description stated that every attack parried by his structures permanently strengthened the defender's own body. Below, the creatures pounded the wall again and again. Inscriptions appeared one after another. Resilience 2. Resilience 3. Resilience 5. Cade felt his skin take on a strange density, as if a layer of felt had been placed beneath it. Bram fired from the tower and took down 2 creatures. The rest scraped at the stone until dawn, and at first light, they retreated into the wastelands. Cade climbed down and inspected the wall. Not a single crack, but a new line glowed in his inner vision. 10 points of resilience accumulated. Technology unlocked. First circle stone masonry. Knowledge flooded into Cade's mind. Not words, but immediate skill. He now knew how to lay stone without mortar, so that the masonry could withstand a battering ram. He knew the angles, the jointing, and the weight distribution. It was similar to his old engineering intuition, but deeper and more precise. The talent didn't just strengthen him. His talent learned from every blow he parried and taught him in return. Cade stood by the wall and smiled slowly for the first time in a long while. The Academy had cast him aside like trash. They simply hadn't understood what they'd given him. Bram climbed down from the watchtower and saw that smile. He said the boy should be afraid, not smirking. Cade replied that now it was those who came to his wall who should be afraid. Bram wanted to smirk but couldn't. That night, he'd seen with his own eyes how the claws that tore through chainmail had helplessly scraped against the former rotten palisade. During the day, Cade went to the site of the night's battle from the outside. He crouched over the tracks, and his expression grew serious. On top of the small tracks left by the scavengers, an imprint the size of a wagon wheel was pressed into the ground. 3-toed. Deep. Someone large had stood in the darkness behind the scavengers that night and simply watched. It watched and then went back to the wastelands. Bram bent over the track and his tanned face turned pale. He said that such tracks were left by the hounds of a foothill herd, and that hounds never travel alone. He said that the pack leader always runs at the front of the pack, and that the leader had come to scout. Cade straightened up and looked at his low stone palisade, then at the riverbank where piles of boulders lay. He said they would need a real wall, and that they might have a week. Cade reinforced the Terran home and, during a nighttime attack by the scavengers, unlocked a hidden rule of his talent. Every attack repelled by the wall permanently increased his personal resilience, and accumulated resilience unlocked construction technologies, and he obtained first circle stone masonry. The leader of the mountain herd's hounds was watching the scavengers, and Cade realized that the herd would arrive in a week. The week condensed into 7 days of non-stop construction. Cade marked out the new wall's outline, wider than the old palisade, and work began with the assembly of the large stones. First take, Cade stands waist-deep in the river, fusing the boulders into blocks with his strength, while the blacksmith Dolan maneuvers them with a crowbar, unable to believe his own back as the blocks, weighing as much as 3 men, glide along the wooden rollers, reinforced by Cade rollers as if on butter. Second cut. Night. Cade lays the masonry by the light of a campfire. His hands find the right angle on their own. The knowledge of the first circle guides him as an experienced master guides an apprentice. Joint to joint. Binding, keystone, third cut. Martha brings a pot of soup to the construction site and freezes with her mouth agape because where there were rope markings yesterday, today stands a wall 1.5 times a man's height. Fourth cut. Bram is herding a dozen men with spears across the courtyard. He no longer argues with Cade. He silently carries out his requests, and this frightens the men more than any shouting ever could. By the end of the 7th day, Turnholm was surrounded by a stone ring, 2 men tall, with a battlements on top, and a single gate made of stained oak fastened with Dolan staples. Cade had infused the gate with so much power that the cut surface of the wood gleamed like black glass. His power node had tripled in size over the course of the week. The herd arrived on the 8th night. At first, the ground began to tremble slightly. Then a sound rolled out of the darkness of the wasteland, the unified pounding of hundreds of hooves and a low chorus of gulps. The villagers crowded into the tavern's stone cellar. Cade, Bram, Dolan, and 7 men with spears remained by the wall. Out of the darkness, into a strip of moonlight, the pack emerged. 50 hounds, each the size of a bull, eyeless muzzles with jaws full of 3 rows of teeth, and behind them, the leader slowly stepped forward. He was taller than the wall. Plates of bone armor covered his chest and withers. Bram whispered that he hadn't seen any this big, not even during the war. The hounds crashed into the wall in a wave. The stone shuddered but held firm, and silver inscriptions poured before Cade's eyes like a waterfall. 12? 15? 20? Every claw strike and every battering charge on the other side of the masonry reverberated through Cade's body with increasing intensity. He felt his bones growing heavier, his skin becoming like tanned hide. The men stabbed at him with spears from above. Bram fired his crossbow point blank. One hound scrambled over the bodies of its kin and leaped over the top of the wall. It knocked Cade off his feet and slashed his chest with its claws. The fabric of his jacket ripped open. The claws that had torn through the chainmail sliced across Cade's skin, leaving only white streaks. The creature froze for a moment in dull bewilderment. Bram drove a bolt into the back of its head. He jerked Cade and stared at his unharmed chest, unable to utter a word. Endurance, 40. Technology unlocked. Loopholes and machiculae, knowledge, flooded back into his head. Cade bellowed through the roar that they needed to step back from the edge and strike through the gaps between the battlements. The formation reorganized. The casualties stopped. Below, the leader finally moved forward. The herd parted. The giant gathered speed and slammed into the gate with the full weight of his bone armor. A thunderous crash reverberated through the settlement. The seasoned oak bent inward, but held firm. Cade slid down from the wall and pressed both palms against the gate from the inside. He met each new charge from the leader by channeling his strength directly into the wood. The wood and immediately snapped back. It was a duel. A body as heavy as a boulder against a slender youth, with his palms pressed against the oak planks. The leader struck 9 times. Before the 10th blow, the silver inscription flashed brighter than before. Resilience 75. High order attack parried. Defender granted skeletal reinforcement. A cold fire seared Cade's spine. He met the 10th blow without wavering. The gate hurled the leader backward. The giant sank heavily onto his hind legs. Dark blood oozed from the cracks in his bony plates. He was a battering ram and did not know how to retreat, but something ancient within him recognized a wall that could not be broken. The leader rose and let out a long, roaring cry. The herd receded from the walls and fled into the darkness after him. Silence hung over the wall. Then Dolan laughed. His laughter was hoarse and incredulous. The men hugged each other. Martha climbed out of the cellar and wept as she looked at the intact houses. Bram approached Cade and silently handed him his flask. It was a gesture that, on the frontier, meant more than any words. Cade took a swig and coughed, and they all laughed again. By morning, the joy was over. Cade and Bram followed the herd's tracks 3 versts into the wasteland and climbed a gray hill. Bram gazed into the distance, and his fingers tightened of their own accord on the crossbow's stock. The valley beyond the hill had been trampled down to bare earth, thousands of tracks. Fire pits strewn with gnawed bones. The pack of hounds wasn't a horde. It was an advance party. And among the thousands of paw prints stretching across the valley was a chain of tracks that sent a chill down Cade's spine. The tracks were bipedal, 3 times the size of human footprints. And next to them, a smooth, round imprint was pressed into the ground, as if someone had set a chained staff down on the earth. Whoever led this horde knew how to walk on 2 legs and carried gear. Bram said he'd only ever heard of such a thing from his grandfather. That once every 100 years, the wastelands give birth to a herder who gathers all creatures into a single army. Cade looked south, where his village, with its 2-story wall, lay hidden behind the hills. Just yesterday, it had seemed mighty to him. Today, it was merely a first draft. He said they needed stone. Every last bit of stone in these hills. In a week, Cade built a stone wall and repelled an assault by 50 hounds led by an armored leader. His resilience had risen to 75. His body had become invulnerable to claws, and his talent granted him arrow slits and skeletal reinforcement. Bram finally acknowledged Cade after the claws failed to pierce his skin. Reconnaissance revealed that the pack was merely the vanguard of a massive horde led by an intelligent, 2-legged herder. 10 days later, a man from the barony arrived in Turnholm. He came in a lacquered carriage with 2 guards and introduced himself as Inspector Aldous Finch. A narrow face, ink-stained fingers. The gaze of a man who has spent his entire life searching for errors in paperwork. He had come because absurd rumors had reached the barony about a stone fortress in the north, while Turnholm's records listed it as a 4th-class village with a stockade. Finch hated discrepancies with the registry more than he hated monsters. He stepped out of the carriage in front of the gate and fell silent for a long time. Before him stood a wall that did not appear in a single document. In 10 days, it had grown another man's height and was now flanked by 2 protruding bastions at the corners. Cade met him at the gate. Finch looked over the thin young man with the copper badge, and his ability to speak returned. He said that illegal fortification construction without a barony license was punishable by a fine. He said that a 4th-class village had no right to walls taller than 1.5 man heights. He said that the stone had likely been quarried without a mining concession. With each phrase, his voice grew firmer. Bram flushed and reached for his axe, but Cade stopped him with a wave of his hand. Cade calmly asked whether a herder leading a horde of 10,000 beasts toward the border was recorded in the registers. Finch pursed his lips and replied that stories about herders were just children's tales and that spreading panic was also punishable by a fine. At that moment, a sentry shouted from the watchtower. The horde had not come at night, as expected. It had come in broad daylight because whoever was leading it was not afraid of the light. The horizon of the wastelands darkened, and the darkness was moving. Finch climbed the wall after everyone else and saw it with his own eyes. A sea of gray bodies stretching from one end to the other. Hounds and scavengers and hunchbacked creatures with bony crests and slithering behemoths resembling slugs in stone armor. And behind the army, on the hill, stood a 2-legged figure as tall as 3 trees, leaning against a chained pillar. Even from here, one could sense that it was watching. Finch slid down the inner staircase and crawled under the cart. His guards had deserted to the cellar. The first wave slammed into the wall an hour later. After that, time dissolved into a roar and dust and silver inscriptions. Defense 100, Defense 140. The creatures poured in like an avalanche. Bram's men struck back through the battlements. Dolan poured boiling resin from the wall. Cade stood in the center of the battlements with his palms pressed against the stone, holding the entire wall together as a single organism. His heightened knot of power allowed him to sense every crack and tighten it before it widened. Then the driver stirred on his hill and swung his staff. The horde parted, and slugs in stone armor crept forward. They crawled up to the wall and began to draw its foundation into themselves. The stone dissolved in their acidic flesh. The wall trembled. The southeast corner sagged by a palm's width. Cade rushed over. Beneath his palms, the masonry was fusing back together, but the acid was eating away at it faster than he could repair it. The power node was running dry. For the first time since the awakening ceremony, Cade tasted true defeat. And then, an old memory surfaced in his mind. In a past life, he had once witnessed a building collapse. He'd known an hour before the collapse that the concrete in the supports had been watered down, and he'd shouted about it. But those looking to cut corners hadn't listened to him. He'd died beneath that slab. The memory lasted a single heartbeat and brought not fear, but cold clarity. You can't repair a support while it's under load. You have to transfer the load. Cade shouted at Brahma to get everyone away from the southeast curtain wall. Then, he did something he didn't expect of himself. He let the corner collapse, but collapse according to his own plan. Pouring in his last drops of strength, he broke the masonry so that the multi-metric ton mass of stone collapsed outward and buried all three slimes at once beneath it. A silver cascade of inscriptions blinded him. Siege-type attack reflection counted. Resilience, 200. Threshold reached. Second circle technology unlocked. Self-repairing bastion. Defender's regeneration granted. The knowledge of the second circle was beyond human comprehension. Cade saw the wall not as stones, but as a flow of stresses, and learned to close that flow into a loop. He pressed his palms against the breach, and the stones crept toward one another of their own accord. The wall began to rebuild itself, just as bone heals. The horde pounded against it until sunset, and the wall healed every wound faster than the beast could inflict it. As the last light faded, the herder on the hill drove a stake into the ground. The horde receded like the ebb tide and spread across the wastelands in a ring around the settlement, out of firing range. The herder did not leave. He sat down on the hill and remained watching. It was worse than an assault. It was a siege. That night, Finch crawled out from under the wagon. He approached Cade, who was sitting by the gate, chewing Martha's bread. The inspector was silent for a long time, his ink-stained fingers crumpling the register. Then he said quietly, his voice no longer the same, that according to the barony's charter, a settlement that had withstood a horde's assault was granted fortress status, and its defender the right to build independently. He said he would rewrite all the papers and personally deliver to the baron a petition for reinforcements and supply trains. He said even more quietly that today, for the first time in 20 years of service, he had seen why walls were truly necessary. Cade nodded and offered him some bread. And in the morning, the sentry spotted the worst within the siege perimeter. The horde wasn't just standing there. Hundreds of creatures were digging into the ground and hauling stones, and the herder was pacing among them with his staff like a foreman on a construction site. The horde was building something of its own, siege ramps. Bram said that now it was clear why the herder was called the herder. He herds not only creatures, he herds war itself. Cade looked at the swarming ring and did the math. There was enough food in the settlement to last 3 weeks. There was almost no stone left inside the walls. And outside the wall, 10,000 teachers awaited him, each blow from them making him stronger. He smiled at the thought and went to mark out the foundation of the inner citadel. Inspector Finch had arrived to punish Cade for the illegal wall, but survived the Herder's horde's assault and became an ally. promising a statue from the fortress and reinforcements. Cade repelled the besieging slimes by sacrificing a corner of the wall, according to his calculations, and received the second tier of technology, featuring self-repairing bastions and regeneration, while his resilience reached 200. The horde did not leave but laid siege to the settlement and is building earthworks. Moreover, food left for 3 weeks. The siege changed Turnholm faster than any peaceful life ever could. On the third day, the first refugees emerged from the hills toward the southern gates, 12 people from a burned-down farmstead across the river. The horde had scorched everything in its path northward, and the survivors were heading toward the only light in the night. Drawn by rumors of a fortress that had held out, Cade opened the gates for them. Bram grumbled that extra mouths would wear them down faster than the monsters, but Cade saw it differently. Among the refugees were 2 stonemasons, a hunter, and a woman who knew herbs. Every pair of hands was a stone in his wall. By the end of the week, there were 6 dozen refugees, and life inside the walls was in full swing. First cut. The stonemasons are dismantling old sheds, and Cade is laying the quarried stone into the foundation of the inner citadel. Second cut. Martha is overseeing the communal pot and distributing food according to Finch's lists. He unexpectedly proved indispensable because record-keeping was his forte. Third cut. Dolan forges arrowheads from remelted horseshoes, while the boys, under Bram's supervision, learn to load crossbows. Fourth scene. A hunter and his son lower the fishing nets, reinforced by Cade, into the river, and the river begins to supply the fortress with fish, a source the besiegers cannot cut off. The driver behind the wall was building as well. His earthworks rose toward the sky in 3 gray mounds. It became clear that he was constructing ramps leading straight to the crest of the wall. In response, Cade raised the wall higher and added new bastions to it. 200 points of resilience had transformed his body beyond recognition. He hoisted blocks that had previously required 3 men to move. The cut from Dolan's knife healed before his very eyes while Dolan was apologizing. At night, Cade sometimes felt as though he could hear his own heart beating like a hammer striking an anvil. Steady, heavy, superhumanly calm. On the 12th night, the herder tested a new weapon. Cade woke to a whistling sound. Not from the walls, from above. He ran out into the courtyard and saw the stars fading in streaks. Winged shadows were falling from the black sky onto the settlement. Screechers. Creatures the size of a dog, with membranous wings and tails like bone whips. The wall was powerless against the sky, and the driver knew it. The screechers dove toward the rooftops. The hayloft caught fire. A woman screamed. Bram fired his crossbow haphazardly, but the sky was black and the shadows were swift. One creature fell on Cade from above and lashed his face with its tail. The bone whip, capable of severing a head, left a white streak on his cheek. And for the first time, Cade used his resilience not for defense. He grabbed the creature by the tail and slammed it into the ground like a hammer. But there were hundreds of creatures, and he was alone. The walls could not help him, because the blows did not strike them. The silver inscriptions were silent. His resilience did not grow. Cade stood in the middle of the burning courtyard and realized he had reached the limit of his talent. His talent protected only what had been built. That meant he had to build the sky. The thought was insane, and he clung to it. He herded the people into a stone cellar and an unfinished citadel. Then he stood in the center of the courtyard by the well and placed his palms on the well ring, which was connected by its foundations to all the walls at once. He poured his entire reserve of power into the structures without reserve and demanded the impossible from the second circle, to unite everything into one. The walls, the bastions, the citadel, and the foundations responded. The stone hummed. Thin, glowing threads stretched upward from the crest of the wall, like the framework of an invisible tent. Vizgun flew into the thread and was cut in half. A silver inscription flashed so brightly that Cade had to squint. air attack deflection counted. Resilience, 260. Third circle technology unlocked. Small protective dome. And the knowledge of the third circle crashed down on him like an avalanche, knocking him to his knees. This was no longer mere construction. This was the architecture of power. He could now see how to channel magic through stone as easily as water through gutters. The threads above the settlement thickened into a shimmering web. The Vizguns crashed into it and burned, and each death made the web denser. By dawn, the surviving creatures fled north, and the dome melted away, leaving behind the scent of a thunderstorm and 300 units of resilience in Cade's body. People emerged from their shelters and looked at him in silence. This was no longer the astonishment of skeptics. It was something Cade didn't know how to handle. Old Martha bowed to him at the waist, and the others began to bow after her. Cade lifted her by the shoulders and said that they should bow to the walls, and that the walls had been built by everyone together. But their gazes did not change. In those gazes, he ceased to be a boy defender and became something greater. On the 14th day of the siege, a mounted patrol in the barony's colors broke through from the south toward the gates. Finch ran out to meet his men and returned from them looking somber. He brought 2 pieces of news. The first was good. The Baron had read his petition and declared Turnholm a crown fortress, and a grain convoy was already on its way along the southern road. Finch struggled to deliver the second piece of news. The petition had been forwarded to the capital, above the Baron's authority. And the capital had responded with an order bearing the royal seal. It was not only the fortress that was declared the property of the crown. The decree bore the name of Cade Valorn, and ordered that the defender, possessing a unique talent, be brought before the military council for study and utilization. A detachment of royal knights, led by a fire-wielding hero, whose name Cade remembered all too well, had already set out in pursuit. Cedric Lan had received his first assignment from the crown. And that night, the wastes responded to the death of the Screechers. The 3 mounds of the Herder rose to their full height, and lights flared on the middle one. The Herder stood between the bonfires, striking the ground with a chained pillar in a steady rhythm. Blow after blow, and far to the north, beyond the ridge, something began to answer him in the same rhythm. The earth trembled in time with the beat. Bram listened to this call and response and said that the herder was not, after all, the master of the horde. He was merely a shepherd driving the herd, and now the shepherd was calling for the master. Cade stood on the wall between 2 threats. From the south, they were coming for his freedom. From the north, what was awakening beyond the ridge was coming toward him. He placed his palm on the warm stone of his wall, and the stone responded with a steady hum, as if alive. Cade said quietly, "Let them all come. I've just run out of space for training." The fortress took in the refugees and withstood a nighttime attack by flying screechers, against which the walls were powerless. But Cade created a protective dome after attaining the 3rd circle of technology and 300 units of resilience. The capital declared Turnholm the property of the crown and dispatched a detachment led by Cedric Lan to bring Cade a military for study. The driver turned out to be merely a servant, and with the rhythmic thuds of the pole, he awakens his true master beyond the northern ridge. The crown's detachment arrived before the grain convoy. On the 16th day of the siege, a sentry from the southern watchtower sounded his horn twice, and Cade climbed onto the wall above the gates. A column was moving along the southern road. 24 knights in jet-black armor, with royal griffins on their cloaks. At the front, riding a white horse, was a rider clad in scarlet. Even from that distance, Cade recognized his posture and the way his shoulders carried themselves. Cedric Lan rode up to the wall and raised his head. Over the past year, his shoulders had broadened, and his shoulder guards glowed with runes of fire. He shouted for the gates to be opened in the king's name. Cade replied from above that the gates would open for the king's men once the king's men stated the purpose of their visit. Cedric laughed with the same laugh he'd let out in the academy hall. He said he'd come to reclaim state property, a unique talent belonging to the crown. He said that the fence tamer had finally come in handy, and that the capital's laboratories would extract the secret of his resilience for the benefit of true warriors. He spoke loudly so that the entire wall could hear. A year ago, those words would have worked, but the people on the wall saw the dome overhead and the claws sliding across their defender's skin. Dolan spat down. Bram pointedly rested his crossbow on a crenel. Cade remained silent, looking past Cedric at the knights. Tired faces, the dust of the campaign, and the way their horses twitched their ears toward the wastelands. The horses sensed the horde. Cade said he was inviting the squadron inside for rest and dinner, and suggested postponing the discussion about their belongings until morning. Cedric wanted to snap back, but the eldest of the knights, a gray-bearded captain named Ortega, touched his elbow and whispered something. The horses were frightened. The men wanted to get inside the walls. The gates were opened. That evening at Martha's Tavern, the knights ate a hot meal for the first time in a week and listened to the men's tales of the 3 assaults. The stories were embellished with hand movements and gestures. Captain Ortega listened in silence, and his gaze kept returning to the young man in a plain jacket who was sitting in the corner, sketching a plan of the 4th bastion on a board. Cedric didn't stay for dinner with the rabble. He went out onto the wall and stopped facing the northern horizon. The 3 mounds of the Whipper were ablaze with lights, and the measured clang of a chained pole rolled across the plain. Cedric watched this and felt something unfamiliar. In the capital, they said there was a commotion among the scavengers in the north. He had been promised an easy task and the glory of taming a wayward classmate. No one had told him about the pounding coming from beyond the horizon that made his hair stand on end. The night passed quietly. But at dawn, the chaser stopped pounding. The silence woke Cade, or rather, the jolt of silence did. He leaped onto the wall a minute before the sentry's cry. The horde was advancing for a full-scale assault, and at the forefront, along 3 newly constructed ramps, massive bone balls were rolling. Creatures coiled into wheels. Battering rams that needed no run-up on the ground, because the height of the ramparts provided their momentum. Cedric leaped onto the wall, half-dressed, and froze. It was the first time in his life he'd seen a sea of bodies stretching to the horizon. Cade was already giving orders. His voice cut through the roar effortlessly. Women and children to the citadel, crews to the battlements, pitch on the left bastion. He turned to Cedric and said simply that if he wanted to survive, he should station his knights at the gates and burn everything that crossed the crest. Cedric opened his mouth to retort about who was in charge here. At that moment, the first bone ball flew off the rampart and struck the wall. The wall groaned, but it held, and a flash of recoil rippled through the stone in blue veins. The self-repairing bastion absorbed the blow and mended the cracks right before the knight's eyes. Ortega crossed himself. Cedric shut his mouth and led the knights to the gates. What followed was a day Turnholm would never forget. Balls pounded the wall one after another, and each blow sent Cade's resilience soaring. 350, 400. The creatures swarmed up the ramparts in a continuous stream. Cedric's knights hacked down those who had broken through at the gates, and the blackened armor quickly lost its ceremonial luster. Cedric himself was burning the screechers in the sky, and for the first time in his life, his flames served not glory, but the salvation of other people's children. And something about this was changing his expression. By noon, the driver unleashed something new. From the depths of the horde, hunchbacked creatures crawled out, and clumps of green fire burst from their crests. Not a physical blow, a magical one. The first clump fell on the wall, and the stone hissed as it dissolved. The silver inscription flashed an alarming warning. Magical attack. Defense incomplete. Resistance partially applied. Cade clenched his teeth. The 3rd circle had granted him a dome, but the dome was devouring the entire power node in a matter of minutes. He needed something else. He ran along the battle path toward the point of impact, And as he ran, his memory provided the solution. In a past life, he had designed grounding systems, diverting electrical discharges into the ground via a conductor. Lightning doesn't destroy a house if the house has a way to discharge it. Cade dropped to his knees by the melted wound in the stone, and instead of patching it up, he began to build a conduit inside the wall. A thin channel of fused sand leading into the foundation and further down into the bedrock beneath the settlement. The next green bolt struck the same spot. The wall swallowed the fire and channeled it down the conduit into the depths. The ground beneath the settlement shook with a dull thud, and that was all. The stone remained intact. The silver waterfall gushed forth with renewed force. Magical attack repelled by complete absorption. Resilience, 500. Third circle enhancement unlocked, lightning conducting veins. The knowledge clicked into place like a missing piece in a mechanism. By sunset, Cade had laid the veins along the entire perimeter, and the wall began to soak up the Horde's magic like a sponge. The hunchbacks struck again and again, and each of their volleys made the fortress's defender stronger. By nightfall, the Horde had run out of steam and retreated. The ramparts were deserted. Bone spheres lay beneath the wall, cracked open like eggs. Turnholm had held out for the fourth time. On the wall, amid the soot, stood Cedric Land, staring at his hands. The flames had burned through his reserves to the last drop for the first time in his entire illustrious life. A man with a spear standing nearby slapped him on the shoulder and said that the fire mage was fighting like a champ, and that Martha would pour him a drink first. Cedric wanted to reply haughtily, but all that came out of his throat only a hoarse "thank you" emerged. He caught sight of Keed. He was standing on the far bastion, a living lightning rod for their fortress, and the wall beneath his feet glowed with light. Cedric approached. He was silent for a long time. Then he said quietly that he had the crown's order in his bag and that he was obliged to carry it out. But he also said that for the first time he had seen a talent that, on its own, was worth an army, and that taking that talent away from here now would mean killing everyone behind the wall. He said he would write the truth to the council and ask Ortega to confirm every word. Cade nodded and replied that the capital would need him anyway, alive and right where he was, because that night from the bastion, he had seen something the others hadn't yet seen. The tapping of the chained pillar was no longer needed. Beyond the northern ridge, against the backdrop of the stars, the mountain range was changing shape. One of the peaks was slowly turning. Cedric Land had arrived to take Cade to the War Council, but had been caught in the Horde's general assault and fought for the fortress, burning through his entire reserve. Cade repelled the bone, battering rams, and magical volleys by creating lightning-conducting veins, raising his resilience to 500, while Cedric decided to write the truth to the capital instead of carrying out the order. Beyond the northern range, something the size of a mountain peak began to move. The peak took 3 days to pass. By day, it was hidden by a dusty haze that it itself stirred up. And by night, its silhouette rose higher and higher against the backdrop of the stars. The earth now trembled constantly to the slow rhythm of its footsteps. The dishes in the houses of Turnholm clinked softly without ceasing, and the people had grown accustomed to this clinking as they had to the wind. The Horde was greeting its master. 10,000 throats howled through the nights, and the herder paced the embankments, striking a pole in time with the footsteps coming from beyond the ridge. Cade hadn't slept for these 3 days. He was building, and the fortress was being built alongside him through a montage of feverish cuts. First cut. 400 refugees, who had been driven to the walls over the past week, were dismantling the last sheds, stone by stone, and Cade was joining the second ring of walls around the first. Second section. Dolan and the stonemasons, following Cade's blueprints, were assembling the frames of giant crossbows on the bastions, while Cade reinforced the shoulders so that the torsion can be cranked by 6 men. Third cut. Finch, with a scribe's meticulousness, counts every sack from the supply convoy that has finally arrived, and his lists transform 400 mouths from the crowd into a garrison. Fourth cut. Ortega and Bram drill the militia and knights in a single formation, and the blackened armor stands in a row alongside the sheepskin jackets. Cedric has been training a firing squad of 3 village lads who, upon awakening, were found to possess sparks of the gift. A year ago, he wouldn't have let such men come within a shot's range of him. Now he was teaching them to channel their flames into a single volley and yelling at them with the same passion with which he had once yelled at his servants. On the evening of the 3rd day, he climbed up to Cade at the new gate bastion. Cade stood motionless, his palms resting on the stone. His endurance had surpassed 600, and his body had finally ceased to be human in essence, though it remained human in appearance. He wasn't cold.
Fatigue came and went in waves, leaving no trace. His heart beat like a steady hammer. Cedric stood beside him and asked what Cade saw. Cade replied that he saw a mistake. Everyone was looking at the advancing mountain, but he was looking at the herder. The herder had stopped driving the horde toward the assault. The shepherd was waiting. So all the previous waves hadn't been attempts to take the fortress. They had been training. The master was being led to be fed, not by a village. The master was being led to be fed by a wall that had learned to repel everything. Cade said quietly that someone out there in the wastes wasn't breeding beasts. Someone was breeding sieges, and the Turnholm wall had been built like a whetstone for something that needed to be able to break down any wall. Cedric was silent for a long time. Then he said that at the academy, they'd been taught that monsters had no plan. Cade replied that they'd been taught many things at the academy. At dawn, on the 4th day, the mist settled, and the master emerged toward the fortress. It was not a mountain. It was what remained of a mountain after a body had hatched from it, a shell of layered rock. 6 supporting limbs, each as thick as a keep. There was no head at all. Instead, between the plates of its armor, a deep white glow smoldered like molten lava in a crater. The horde's creatures fell to their knees as it passed over them. The driver trudged alongside the colossus, and his 3-meter-tall figure looked like a mouse at the foot of an ox. Finch, on the wall, took off his glasses, wiped them, put them back on, and said in a lifeless voice that nothing like this existed in any of the kingdom's records. Bram said nothing. He had fought for 30 years and knew when words were no longer enough. The giant stopped half a verst away. A white glow flared between the plates, and he struck without a swing or a run-up. He simply shifted his weight, and one of the 6 supports fell from the sky onto the outer ring of the wall. The world shuddered. Cade took the blow with the entire fortress network. The lightning conductors howled, channeling monstrous energy into the rocky foundation. The self-repairing bastions sealed the cracks. The outer ring sagged by an elbow's length but held firm. Silver inscriptions flashed to life, and Cade gasped at their message. A Titanic-class attack has been repelled. Resilience, 1,000. The Great Threshold has been reached. The 4th circle has been unlocked. Livingstone, a wave of change swept across the walls of Turnholm from the gate bastion. The stone darkened and filled with a deep gray light. The wall ceased to be a structure built of stones. It became something that had grown, a single unified whole. Cade now felt every cubit of it as if it were his own skin, and the feeling was mutual, for the wall began to respond. It positioned its own thickened sections to absorb the next blows. It arched its buttresses to meet the load. The giant struck 8 more times. 8 times the world shuddered, and 8 times the Livingstone met the Titan's force, redistributing the blow across the entire ring and channeling the excess into the depths. Cade's resilience grew in leaps and bounds, unlike anything he'd experienced in all those months. 1,500. On the 9th blow, his body instinctively positioned itself between the battlements, and he caught himself wanting to offer his palm, not the wall, to the Titan's strike. He suppressed that desire. It was too soon.
After the 9th blow, the giant paused. A white glow flashed, and in that instant, Cade sensed not fury, but attention. The Titan was studying, just as Cade himself had studied every parried attack. Then the giant did something that sent a chill through the entire wall. He carefully lowered himself onto his belly, half a verst from the fortress, gathered his footing, and froze. The driver sounded the alarm, and the horde began to dig in around the Titan in a wide ring. Bram was the first to break the silence. He said that the beast had realized a surprise attack wouldn't work, and had settled down to think. And when something the size of a mountain is thinking, people have to think too. Bad news arrived from the south by evening. Ortega's scouting party sent to meet the second convoy had returned. The convoy was nowhere to be found. The road south had been cut off 20 versts away. There were fresh tracks from a second, smaller horde that had emerged from the eastern gorges. Terrancombe was completely cut off from the kingdom, and at night, standing on the living wall, Cade heard something new. Through the stone, through the rocky foundation into which he had been channeling the energy of his blows for months, a reverberation came from below. Deep, rhythmic, familiar to the point of making him tremble. Somewhere far beneath the wastelands, something else was pounding in response to the channeled energy. And this tapping was like the tapping of the herder's chained pillar, just as an echo resembles a voice. A Titan the size of a mountain approached the fortress and with 9 strikes raised Cade's resilience to 1,500, unlocking the 4th circle of the living stone, after which the walls became a single sentient organism. The Titan did not leave but laid siege to the fortress alongside the horde and a second horde that had cut off the southern road, and Cade realized that all the assaults had been training and that his wall had been honed like a whetstone. From the depths beneath the wastelands, through the rocky bedrock, a tapping sound similar to the rhythm of the chaser's pillar, answered Cade. The tapping from the depths haunted Cade for 3 nights. It came only through the living stone, and only when Cade pressed his palms against the wall and listened with his whole body. The rhythm echoed the driver's blows with a delay and distortion, like a student repeating after a teacher, or like a prisoner tapping through the thick rock. On the 4th night, Cade resolved to do something he had told no one about except Bram. He wasn't going to listen from the wall. He was going to listen from under the ground. Turnholm's well plunged 20 roasts into the bedrock, and Cade descended on a rope he had secured himself all the way to the water, and then took a step into the impossible. The 4th circle made stone as malleable as water for him. The rock parted before his palms and closed behind his back, leaving an air-filled capsule. He walked through the foundation of the world, downward and sideways, toward the sound. Bram remained by the well with the rope and prayers he did not understand. At a depth of 40 rosts, the thud became bone-deep. It no longer reverberated in his palms, but in his teeth. And at a depth of 60, the rock ended. Cade's palms passed through a layer of rock and revealed a void. He widened the opening and stepped onto the ledge of a gigantic cavern. Below him, a white city smoldered. Not human. Streets as wide as a river. Arches under which a Titan could pass without stooping. Walls made of the same living stone that now rose above Turnholm, only an eternity older. And all of it lay in ruins. The arches were broken. The streets were torn apart. Throughout the cavern, bony growths jutted from the walls and pavements like nails driven into the city's body. Cade stood on the ledge, and the knowledge of the 4th circle stirred within him as recognition. His talent was no accidental gift. His talent was a legacy. Someone had built with this same gift long before humans existed. A tapping sound came from the center of the city. There, amid the ruins, stood the only surviving building. A hemispherical citadel of living stone, its walls glowing a faint gray, like embers beneath the ashes. And around the citadel, in a ring, lay bone-white corpses. Dead Titans. 6 giants of the same kind that had besieged Turnholm lay there as the skeletons fused into the stone. They had died storming this hemisphere, long ago, thousands of years ago. And the hemisphere still stood. And it was tapping. Cade walked down the dead streets.
It felt as though he were walking through the pages of someone else's diary, written in his own handwriting. He stopped at the wall of the hemisphere and pressed his palms against it. The knocking from inside ceased. The pause lasted 10 beats of his hammer-like heart. And then the living stone of the hemisphere came to life beneath his palms and drew them in up to his wrists. And a flood of not knowledge but memory surged into Cade's head. He saw this city alive. He saw the builders, short, broad figures with glowing gray eyes, whose hands molded the stone as if it were clay. The people of the foundation. They did not wage war. They built, and their walls kept the world of the wastelands in balance for thousands of years. Then, from below, from the very depths, came that which burrows. The memory offered no image, only the builders' terror and the speed with which their world crumbled. The Titans were not of the wastelands. The Titans were siege weapons bred by that which burrows to break down the walls of the people of the foundation. And the drivers were overseers bred in its wake. The city fell. The survivors barricaded themselves in the last citadel and held off the siege of 6 Titans, while their walls built up resilience, just as Cade had built it up. They killed all 6. And then they could not escape because that which burrows awaited outside. So they sealed themselves in and pounded the stone for thousands of years, transmitting a single message upward. Cade saw the last of them, a withered figure by the inner wall, with a petrified hand raised to strike. It was no longer the hand that was pounding. The citadel itself was pounding, repeating the embedded rhythm after the death of the last heart. The message was simple, and memory imprinted it directly into Cade. A new builder is growing above. That which burrows senses him through every blow fused into the earth. It sends Titans not to break his wall, it sends Titans to raise his wall. Because that which digs does not eat stone. It eats resilience, matured, accumulated. It breached the citadel of the people of the foundation from within on the day its resilience reached its limit and became ripe for it. They were saved only because the last builder managed to shed what had been accumulated, to reset the wall. Leaving that which burrows, an empty shell. Cade's hands were free. He stood in dead silence, and within him, the picture of the world he had been building for months was crumbling. Every attack he parried made him stronger. It wasn't a reward, it was fattening him up. The 1,500 units of resilience inside him weren't armor. They were excess weight. And somewhere in the true depths, that which burrows had already heard him through the veins of the lightning rods and was creeping toward him, drawn by the scent. Cade was returning to the surface through the rock, thinking with a coldness and speed he'd never known before. To shed his resilience like the people of the Foundation meant leaving 400 people behind bare walls against a Titan and 2 hordes. To keep stockpiling meant ripening for the maw in the depths. There remained a third path that the builders had not found. They stockpiled and hid. He could stockpile and strike first. Feed the digger not half-baked resolve, but the kind that would choke it. Above, dawn awaited him, along with Bram, whose hair had turned a third grayer overnight while waiting by the well. Cade told him everything, and only him. The old man listened without interrupting. Then he asked just one thing. How much resilience does it take to crush the thing that devours mountains? Cade replied that he didn't know, but he would find out from the only one who could show him the limit, the Titan behind the wall. The creature had been sent to raise him. That meant the creature would strike while he was growing. He intended to grow faster than they expected of him. And by day, the siege began to stir. The Titan, half a verst away, rose from its belly. But it did not turn toward the fortress. It turned south, where a second horde was approaching, along the severed road to Tornholm. And following the horde, a column flying the banners of the crown emerged onto the hills along the southern road. 3,000 royal infantry and a wedge formation of knights. The capital did not wait for Cedric's letters. The capital sent an army straight into the jaws of the battle between the Titan and the 2 hordes. Cade passed through there the rock beneath the wasteland and found the dead city of the people of the Foundation, built by ancient builders with the same talent who, thousands of years ago, had slain 6 titans but perished at the hands of that which burrows. He learned a terrible rule. Resilience is sustenance, and that which gnaws sends titans to raise defenders, so it can devour the ripened resilience. One can only survive by shedding it or feeding it something that will choke it. Meanwhile, the Crown's army of 3,000 men approached Turnholm, right between the Titan and the 2 hordes. The army was led by Lord Marshal Uther Cronenberg, and he made the mistake of everyone who reads about war in reports. The report stated there was a horde of up to 10,000 beasts and a rebellious fortress holding a royal fire wielder. The reports made no mention of the Titan because not a single messenger from the north had managed to break through. Cronenberg spotted the Colossus from the hills along the southern road when it was too late to turn the column around. A second horde was already closing in on his rear, following his very tracks. Cade watched from the wall as the catastrophe unfolded. 3,000 men in an open field, caught between a hammer and the anvil. The infantry formed a square with doomed ant-like precision. The Titan advanced toward them, each step devouring 100 fathoms. Cedric, standing nearby, clenched the battlement so hard that his soot-stained gloves burst at the seams. Down there marched the regiments among which he had grown up. Ortega said flatly that the square would hold out against the horde for an hour, but against the Titan, just one step. Cade had already done the math, and the result was madness. The fortress couldn't reach the army. That meant the army had to reach the fortress. Between the field and the gates lay half a verst of open ground under the second horde. Half a verst of death, unless they could cover it with a wall. Cade turned to Bram and Cedric and said that he was about to do something he'd never tried himself, and that if he succeeded, the gates should be opened. If not, they should close them forever. Then he leaped down from the wall, not down the ladder. He simply stepped from a height of 2 men's heights, and the ground sprang back under the weight of 1,500 units of resilience. He ran toward the army across the open field, and as he ran, for the first time, expanded the 4th circle, not upward, but outward. The living stone heard its builder. The earth split open behind him, and a wall rose from it. Not a siege wall, a marching wall. As tall as a man and as thick as an elbow. But it grew at the speed of his run, spreading out in 2 wings from the fortress gates, cutting off a corridor across the field. The knot of power was melting away monstrously. Cade burned with it like a torch. But over the months of the siege, the knot had grown into a lake, and now the lake was spilling over as a wall. The horde howled and surged straight at him. The first beast crashed into the fresh stone, and the silver inscriptions clicked into place as usual, replenishing what he was expending. He ran and built, and his own resilience restored strength with every blow the wall absorbed. A vicious cycle. The perpetual motion machine of the siege turned into an offensive. The army witnessed the miracle through the eyes of 3,000 men at once. Across the field, a corridor was breaking through the stone rising from the ground, and along the crest of that stone ran a single man. Cronenberg had been a soldier for 40 years and made decisions quickly. He understood nothing, but he gave the right order. Run in column formation into the corridor. The regiments slipped between the stone wings when the Titan was 300 fathoms away. Cade stood at the end of the corridor facing the giant and made his final move. He raised both wings of the wall behind the retreating army, closing them into a dome over the corridor. A tunnel was formed. A living stone tunnel through which 3,000 men raced toward the gates of Turnholm. The Titan caught up and struck. A pillar as thick as a keep crashed down onto the tunnel 100 fathoms behind Cade. The living stone flexed. It sagged down to the ridges of the people running below. It held, and the full recoil of the titanic blow against the fresh, unhardened stone did not reach the bedrock, which the tunnel had not yet reached. It struck the builder. Cato was slammed into the ridge of the tunnel. The world turned white. Silver lines glowed through the white. A Titanic-class attack on the unfinished structure has been repelled. Overload. Resilience. 2100. Fourth circle enhancement unlocked. Cathedral stone. The ability to channel the power of other gift-bearers into the structure. He stood up. His bones were healing as he moved. The Titan was winding up for a second strike, and Cade met that second strike already understanding the new upgrade. He shouted a single word down into the tunnel. Cedric! The firekeeper was already there. He was leading his 3 village lads in the rear guard of the column. Cedric didn't understand, but he believed. He pressed his palms against the living stone and unleashed a flame into it as he would have against an enemy. The wall absorbed the fire, and Cade channeled the foreign power through the stone's veins like water through the gutters of the third circle. The Titan's second blow struck a section that had been heated from within until it glowed cherry red. The stone did not spring back. The stone pushed him away. The giant's footing was knocked out from under him, and for the first time during the entire siege, he let out a sound. A low rumble of bewilderment caused stones to rain down from the northern ridge. The last regiments rushed through the gates of Turnholm. Cade entered last, and the tunnel behind him sank back into the ground at his command, folding away and returning the stone to the field. There was no need to leave ready-made approaches for the Titan's siege mind. 3,000 men stood in the fortress courtyard, staring at the young man in the torn jacket. Lord Marshal Cronenberg had served the crown for 40 years and knew how to read the battlefield. Today's battlefield was easy to read. All 3,000 of his lives were a gift from this boy. He walked across the courtyard as the crowd parted. The military council's order to deliver this unique talent lay in his breast pocket next to the royal seal. Cronenberg took it out, unfolded it, and reread it. Then he tore it in half, and then in half again, and threw it at his feet. He said loudly, so that the entire courtyard could hear, that the council had ordered the talent to be placed at the crown's disposal. He declared that the order had been carried out. The talent now resided here. He removed his gauntlet and was the first to extend his hand to Cade as an equal commander. The courtyard erupted in the roar of 3,000 voices. And that night, while the fortress hummed with a nearly festive atmosphere for the first time in months, Cade stood alone on the wall and listened to the depths. And the depths had changed. The steady, distant echo from beneath the wastelands was no longer steady. It had grown closer. It had grown faster. And a new overtone had appeared within it, greedy and damp. 2,100 units of resilience wafted through the subterranean darkness like ripe fruit. That which Burrows had finished crawling toward the scent. That which Burrows began to dig. Cade saved Cronenberg's army by forming a living tunnel across the battlefield on the run and took the Titan's blow upon the unfinished stone, gaining 2,100 points of resilience and the cathedral stone, which allows the power of other gifted ones to be woven into the walls, which he tested with Cedric's flame. The Lord Marshal tore up the college's order, declared that the crown was located in Turnholm, and recognized Cade as an equal commander. That which Burrows sensed the ripened resilience and began digging toward the fortress. In the morning, Cade convened a war council in the unfinished citadel and, for the first time, told everyone everything. The dead city below, the people of the Foundation, the Titans as siege weapons. And that which Burrows, which feeds on this growing resolve and is already burrowing its way here. He spoke calmly, without any hope that they would believe him. They believed him immediately, and that was more terrifying than any argument. Cronenberg had seen the living tunnel yesterday, and his faith in the records had died on the southern road. He asked only about the timeline. Overnight, Cade pressed his palms against the rock face in 20 places, and calculated based on the echo's displacement. The creature was moving diagonally upward from below at a speed of about 3 versts per day. The depth of its passage was about 40, 2 weeks, maybe 12 days. Finch, his fingers white, wrote the number in the register, as if by entering it, death itself became manageable. Bram asked the most important question.
Was it possible to kill the thing that had killed the builders? Cade answered honestly. The people of the Foundation didn't kill it. The people of the Foundation saved themselves by shedding their resilience, leaving the creature an empty shell. This is a path available to them as well. It can reset itself and the walls within a week, and the creature will leave to seek other prey. Turnholm would be defenseless against the Titan and the two hordes, but Cronenberg's men and the militia might be able to hold the unprotected walls. Perhaps. The silence lasted a long time. Cedric broke it. He said he'd known Cade since the day of the awakening, and that this option had been raised merely to clear his conscience. He asked what the real plan was. Cade laid out on the table the blueprint he'd been drawing all night. The plan was madness grounded in calculation. That which burrows feeds on resilience. That means it will come straight for the ripest fruit. For Cade. The meeting point isn't chosen by the beast. The meeting point is chosen by the bait. Cade proposed building that point, a trap citadel. Not above ground, but below, deep within the bedrock along the creature's path. A well of living stone whose walls would accumulate resilience every day leading up to the encounter. The cathedral stone allowed the power of every gifted defender to be woven into the trap. The fire of Cedric and his 3 men. The gift of Cronenberg's shield bearers, among whom were 11 bearers of minor talents for strengthening the body. Even the faint healing spark of a woman among the refugees. All woven into the walls of the well. The creature will walk into the trap of its own accord because the trap will be the most delicious thing it has sensed in thousands of years. And when it enters, Cade will do what he observed the last builder of the Foundation people do, only in reverse. That builder channeled resilience outward from the walls. Cade intended to channel all the trap's resilience inward. All at once. 2,000 of his own units and everything accumulated by the well's walls, all compressed in a single blow down the creature's throat the moment it swallows. Feed it so it chokes. Ortega asked what would happen to whoever stood at the center of the discharge. Cade replied that he didn't know. The people of the Foundation had never done anything like this before. The council approved the plan because there was no other option. And the fortress entered the 12 days that would later be called the construction down. The montage of those days is etched into everyone's memory with vivid snapshots. First snapshot. Cade stands in the shaft of the future well, and the rock parts before him like waves, while stonecutters descend behind him, unable to believe they're chiseling the rock with ordinary picks, because Cade softens it before their eyes like wax. Second snapshot. Cedric spends 6 hours a day, he pours flames into the walls of the trap, and his country lads fall beside him, exhausted and happy, while the walls drink in the fire and fill with cherry-red veins. Third scene. Up above, the Titan strikes the fortress every noon, right on schedule, and the garrison has learned to time their lunch to its blows. And with every blow, Cade's veins channel the power down into the trap, adding titanic strength to their nourishment. Fourth scene. The driver darts across the embankments and pounds the pillar more and more frequently because his master, deep below, is moving faster and faster, and the besieging shepherd senses that events have fallen out of his rhythm. By the 10th day, the trapping citadel was ready. A well 60 rosts deep to the roof of the dead city. Walls of 5 layers of living stone, saturated with fire and the small offerings of the 11 shield bearers, along with a healing spark and the resilience of the titanic blows that had been led downward. Cade descended to the bottom, cupped his hands, and shuddered at what he heard. The walls of the trap hummed with the hunger accumulated within them. 4,000 units of collective resilience, not counting his own 2,300. There was no fruit riper than this under this sky and beneath this earth. On the 11th day, the echo in the depths fell silent. Cade stood at the bottom of the well and listened to the silence, which was louder than the pounding. The creature had stopped half a verst away, in a straight line deep within the rock. It sensed him. It was old and cautious. And there was something about this fetus that was too perfect. For a full day, the digger hung motionless in the rock, and the fortress above stayed awake, listening to the silence. And on the 12th day, greed got the better of it, and the world beneath Turnholm trembled as the digging resumed. Cade went upstairs one last time before the confrontation. He walked along the walls of the living fortress, and the walls clung to his palms like dogs to their master. He gave Cronenberg command of the garrison for the duration of the battle below. Martha silently slipped a loaf of bread into his pocket as if he were a child. Bram said nothing, but simply squeezed his shoulder with his hand, and that once again meant more than words. Cedric accompanied him down to the edge of the well. They couldn't go any further. The ledge at the bottom left no room for a second person. At the edge, Cedric said that the priest at the academy had been wrong. The talent that comes once in a generation hadn't fallen to him after all. Cade replied that the priest had been wrong about something else. Such a talent doesn't just fall into one's lap. Such a talent is built. He stepped into the well, and the living stone carried him down on the ledge of its palm. 60 fathoms of darkness, humming with pent-up hunger. At the bottom, he stood in the center of the inscribed release circle, placed his palms on the walls, and waited. The digging was drawing near. The rock no longer transmitted an echo, but a grinding sound. Then, the bottom of the well grew noticeably hot. Then, the first crack ran from bottom to top along the 5-layered wall of the trap, which the living stone immediately sealed. And then, the rock beneath the release circle swelled and burst, and from the gap into the well's darkness rose that which digs. Cade didn't see a body. The body was too vast to be perceived. He saw the mouth, a funnel of layered, living darkness as wide as the entire well, in which millstones, made of the same bony substance as the growths in the dead city, spired downward in concentric rings. And the funnel inhaled. Resilience surged from the walls and from Cade toward the mouth like water into a breach. The devouring had begun. Cade smirked in the face of the ancient darkness and released the final lock. Feed. Cade revealed the truth about that which burrows to the council and, instead of sacrificing resilience, proposed a trap. Over the course of 12 days of the downward construction, he erected a trap citadel well in the rock, accumulating within it 4,000 units of collective resilience from Cedric's fire, the gifts of the shield-bearers, and the Titan's blows led downward. Command of the garrison was handed over to Cronenberg, and Cade descended to the bottom alone. That which gnaws pierced the bottom of the well with a funnel-shaped mouth and began its devouring, while at that moment Cade triggered a reverse discharge of all the accumulated resilience. The discharge moved toward the absorption, and the two streams collided at the mouth of the funnel. Cade felt this collision with his entire being, for he himself was the channel.
The millennia-long breath of that which gnaws drew resilience toward itself, while Cade drove it forward with redoubled force, and in the creature's throat, the two currents twisted into a knot. The bone millstones at the mouth trembled. The rhythm of their rotation faltered for the first time in an eternity. The creature was accustomed to drinking from prey that clung to its resilience until the very end. It had never known prey that poured itself down its throat. 6,300 units of collective resilience passed through the maw in 10 heartbeats. Cedric's flame entered first, and the millstones turned cherry red. Next came the gifts of the shield-bearers, the power of 9 titanic blows channeled downward, and the healing spark that had become poison within the devourer because that which burrows was a creature of decay. The funnel tried to spit it out. Cade wouldn't let it. He turned the 5th layer of the well's walls inward, sealing the living stone over the mouth like a dome, and repeated on the scale of the well what he had once done with the gates against the leader of the hounds. He held the throat of the abyss with his palms and poured and poured. The creature thrashed. The rock within half a verst all around rippled like water. Up above in the fortress, people were knocked off their feet, and the Titan outside the walls leaped up from its belly and roared for the first time, giving a true voice because the pain had reached it through its bond with its master. Cade stood at the epicenter, and his own 2,300 units were the last to be drained. He felt himself emptying. He felt the forgotten human lightness and fragility returning to his body. His resilience was leaving his bones, skin, and heart, the hammer, slowing to a normal human rhythm. He was giving away every last unit of the siege energy he'd accumulated over months, because that was precisely the plan. Not to wound, but to overfeed to death. The last 100 units came as hard as a breath at the bottom of the ocean. His vision was darkening. The stone hands once again became the hands of the gaunt youth from the awakening ceremony. And when the last unit was gone, that which Burrows burst. Not with an explosion. Worse. The bony millstones of the maw stood rigid, jammed by 6,000 units of alien, matured power that there was no way to digest. The layered darkness of the body cracked along its entire length, extending into the depths of the carcass, and from the cracks struck that very gray light of living stone. The resilience of the founding people, absorbed over millennia, burst free from the crumbling devourer. The caverns of the dead city were illuminated as if in broad daylight. The light passed over the bony nail-like growths, and the growths crumbled to dust, and the ancient walls began to breathe. And then the liberated power surged upward along the only path it knew, through the living stone, through the cunning citadel, through the one who stood at its center, empty as a drained cup. Cade had just enough time to think that the cup was about to shatter. The power of the people of the Foundation entered him without asking. Millennia of foreign resilience. The memory of hundreds of builders. He screamed at the bottom of the well and could not hear himself, and the living stone around him screamed along with him, resonating. It lasted an eternity condensed into a single minute. Then it grew quiet. Cade lay at the bottom of the well, face up. Above him, 60 growths away, the mouth of the shaft was growing lighter. He raised his hand toward the light. The hand was still the same thin, human hand. But beneath the skin, veins glowed with an even, deep gray like streaks in marble. A silver inscription unfolded slowly and solemnly. The devourer has been destroyed. The legacy of the Foundation has been accepted. Endurance, 8,000. The fifth circle has been opened. Master Founder. He sat down, then stood up. His body obeyed him in an unfamiliar way, light and terrifying. He pressed his palm against the wall of the shaft, and the wall responded not like a dog to its master, but like a hand to a hand. The boundary between him and the structure no longer existed. He did not climb back up. He simply walked upward through the stone, and the stone carried him like a current carries a swimmer. The fortress greeted him with the deathly silence of the courtyard. Everyone stood where the earthquake had found them, staring at the man who had emerged from the solid wall of the citadel. Bram stepped forward first. He peered closely at the gray veins beneath the skin. He asked hoarsely if he had killed him. Cade replied that he had. And the courtyard did not erupt in screams. The courtyard slowly settled. People sank to the ground where they stood because their legs could no longer support them, drained by the horror that had built up over many days. Martha wept silently. Cronenberg stood at attention as if at a royal review. Then a sentry shouted from the northern wall and everyone turned around. Something unprecedented was happening beyond the walls. The Titan was staggering. The Colossus, as big as a mountain, was shifting his weight, losing his balance, and the white glow between his plates flickered and faded. The death of its master deep within was severing the bond that kept the siege weapon in check. The driver was flailing about at its supports, lashing out frantically in a frenzy, trying to regain control. The Titan stopped staggering. It froze. The glow flared up again, but it was different. Not white, crimson. And with its very first movement, the freed giant lifted a support beam and brought it crashing down on the driver. The herder didn't even have time to jump out of the way. Then, the Titan turned toward the second horde on the southern road and plowed through it like a plow through an anthill. The siege weapon, torn from its moorings, didn't choose its targets.
It crushed everything that moved. Bram said quietly that they had killed the keeper of the menagerie, and now the menagerie was without cages. Cade stared at the crimson glow and calculated his new odds. The creature in the depths was the mind behind this entire war. The mind was dead. What remained was a headless force. 10,000 creatures of the first horde without a shepherd, a mad titan, and the fortress in the midst of it all, with a garrison that had just sunk to the ground in relief. He told Cronenberg to bring the men up onto the walls. Those who lived to see the silence would celebrate. Cade overfed the burrower with a reverse dump of 6,000 units, and the creature burst, releasing the absorbed power of the founding people, which entered Cade, raising his resilience to 8,000 and unlocking the fifth circle of the Master Founder through his fusion with the stone. The Master's death tore the Titan from its tether. It crushed the driver, and driven mad by a crimson glow, is now obliterating the second horde. The fortresses are now threatened by a decapitated horde of 10,000 creatures and an uncontrollable Titan. The Titan had finished off the second horde by sunset and turned toward Turnholm. The crimson glow pulsed between the plates like an inflamed wound. Cade stood on the gate bastion and for the first time looked at the giant without fear, and this absence of fear alarmed him. The fifth circle had changed more than just his body. He looked at the Titan and saw a structure. Support nodes, load lines in the bone plates, resonance voids beneath the armor. The people of the Foundation had bequeathed him more than just strength. They had left him the vision of the builders who had studied these siege weapons for generations while dying under their blows. The Titan struck into the night, without reconnaissance or cunning, for cunning had died along with its master. It simply moved forward and struck. The living stone of the fifth circle met the blows differently than before. The walls did not deflect them. The walls deflected them. Cade guided oblique planes of glide through the fortifications, and the giant supports slid off them, losing their power into the void. Resilience now trickled sparingly, for a sliding blow is not a reflection. Cade wasn't chasing after it. 8,000 units lay within him like an untouched lake, and for the first time in months, he wasn't stockpiling strength. He was stockpiling understanding. For 3 nights, the Titan had pounded the fortress, and for 3 nights, Cade had studied it the way one studies a clock before taking it apart. On the 4th night, he was ready, and he did what left the garrison. He ordered the gates to be opened. Cronenberg asked for confirmation. Bram did not. Bram had seen that look on his face before and simply ordered the crews to hold their positions at the embrasures. Cade stepped out of the gates alone into the open field, heading toward the mountain. The Titan sensed him and turned. A crimson glow flared. To the frenzied machine, a moving target was a command to attack, and the giant charged at the man, picking up speed. The ground shook. Cade stood his ground. 20 fathoms before impact, he dropped to one knee and pressed his palms into the ground. The fifth circle unfolded in its entirety. He wasn't building a wall in front of the Titan. He was reshaping the ground beneath it. In a single heartbeat, the rocky foundation beneath the giant's front supports shifted from a monolithic structure to a layered formation. The mountain-sized creature stumbled under its own momentum, and its supports sank into the now unreliable ground up to the second joints. The Titan collapsed forward. The world shook so violently that no one in the fortress could remain standing. Meanwhile, Cade was already running across the collapsing carcass, up the bony slabs toward that junction beneath the withers where all the load lines converged, the one he'd spent 3 nights calculating from the wall. A crimson glow shone from the cracks. The Colossus thrashed about, plowing through the ground, but the layered trap held its supports in place. Cade reached the junction, plates as thick as a fortress wall. For the fifth circle, the bone of the ancient creature was as solid as stone. He plunged his palms into the armor as if into water and moved inward through the layers toward the heart of the structure. Inside, there was no flesh. Inside was a cathedral.
cavities, struts, and bone-made tie rods arranged in monstrous architecture around a core of white molten matter. The siege weapon, from the inside, turned out to be a building, and buildings obeyed Cade. He stood before the core on a bony gallery and did not do what he had set out to do. He had gone to break the load-bearing node and bring the structure crashing down from within. But the fifth circle saw deeper than his intentions. The core pulsed crimson, not from rage, but from pain. For millennia, the Master's controlling will had flowed through this core like a red-hot rod, and the Master's death had left a ragged wound in the core's connection. The weapon hadn't gone mad. The weapon was screaming. And Cade, a builder to the very marrow of his bones, did what builders do with a cracked core. He placed his palms on the white molten mass and sealed the wound with living stone, his own. A silence fell within the cathedral so profound that he could hear his own breathing. The crimson glow drained from the core like dirty water. What remained was white, smooth. And within that white, Cade sensed a question, not in words. The structure was asking its builder what to hold on to. The Titans were not evil. The Titans were a force awaiting a load. Their master had loaded them with destruction. Cade stood inside a mountain capable of shattering cities and realized that what he held in his palms was a choice that none of the people of the Foundation had ever had. They were killing the machines. No one had tried to rebuild them. He had loaded the core in a single way, a wall. The giant outside stopped shifting. Slowly, it straightened its legs from the scree, which by Cade's will had once again become solid ground. It rose. And striding heavily, it walked not toward the fortress, but around it. Reaching the northern flank, from which the 10,000-strong horde was still howling, the Titan lay down on his belly across the approaches and froze. The mountain took up a defensive position, a living wall as tall as a mountain. On the walls of Turnholm, 4,000 people watched in silence, because there were no words for what they were seeing. Cade emerged from the armor through the cracking plates and walked toward the gate across the field. And the field seemed very long under all those watching eyes. Cedric was waiting for him at the gate. The fire mage looked back and forth between Cade and the reclining giant. Then he said that he now understood why the council had wanted to lock Cade in the laboratory. And he added more quietly that he now understood why this could not have been allowed. That night, the horde launched a full-scale assault on the fortress, leaderless and mindless. And it crashed against the fallen Titan like waves against a cape. By dawn, only 3 remained of the 10,000, and the survivors fled into the wastelands. The siege of Turnholm was over. The 100 days. That is how the chronicles would later record it. And at noon, a messenger rode in from the south on a worn-out horse with a dispatch for Cronenberg, and the Lord Marshal, upon reading it, turned as crimson as a titanium projectile. The capital, upon receiving news of the living fortress and the tamed mountain, drew conclusions in true capital fashion. A royal commission, led by the Chancellor himself, set out for Turnholm. It was empowered to decide the fate of the defender, who, by the very fact of his existence, threatened the crown. For 3 nights, Cade studied the maddened Titan with the gaze of the founders. Then he brought it crashing down by reshaping the ground beneath its supports, penetrated inside, and discovered that the Titan was a suffering weapon with a wounded communication core.
Instead of destroying it, he healed the wound and gave the Titan a new mission, and the mountain lay as a living wall to defend the fortress, against which the horde's nighttime attack crashed, ending the 100-day siege.
A commission from the Chancellor set out from the capital for Turnholm with the authority to decide the fate of this all-too-powerful defender. The commission arrived 2 weeks later, and during those 2 weeks, Turnholm experienced its first taste of peace. Peace turned out to be no less of a task than war, just a different one. Montage of scenes of peace. First scene. Cade dismantles the battle barricades in the inner courtyards, and from the same stone, he builds homes for 600 refugees, houses with living walls that retain heat on their own. Second scene. Dolan opens a school near the smithy for boys with a spark of talent, and Cedric, to his own surprise, ends up staying there as a teacher. Third scene. Martha is now in charge of 3 cauldrons, and the merchants of the first caravan to take the risk are eating her stew, unable to believe they're sitting beneath a wall of legends. Fourth scene. The Titan lying in the north has become overgrown with curious birds, and children gaze at it from the crest of the wall, calling it Sonia. Chancellor Morius Tan rode through the gates with 50 court guards and observed it all through the eyes of a man who had ruled the kingdom for 40 years through fear and calculation. A gaunt old man with a face like faded parchment. He had been studying Kada through narrowed eyes from the very first second. The council was convened in the citadel. The chancellor spoke softly, and every word was a test. He said that the crown was delighted by the feat, that the crown was aware of the 8,000 units of power within a single man, that a man capable of building fortresses was also capable of bringing them down, and that the walls of Verholm and the capital now essentially stood by his permission. He asked directly how Kaid Valorn could guarantee to the crown that in a year's time he would not proclaim himself king of the north. Everyone in the hall tensed. Cronenberg's hand came down on the table too heavily. Cedric leaned forward. Kay did not answer immediately. He thought about the question honestly, because the question was honest beneath all its venomous gentleness. Then he said that there were no guarantees, nor could there be. The chancellor would not believe a word, and oaths are only kept by those who keep their word even without them. That's why he's offering not a guarantee, but a deal in which betrayal isn't profitable. He unfolded on the table a map of the northern borders that he'd been sketching for the past 2 weeks. The wastelands of the slain lord aren't the only ones. The legacy of the Foundation had taken root in him not only through power, but also through memory, and that memory knew. There are 7 such strongholds beneath the world. 7 slumbering devourers, and sooner or later, each will begin to nurture a defender for itself somewhere on foreign borders. Cade was offering the crown neither a subject nor a prisoner. He was offering the Order of the Foundation, a school for builders and defenders here in Turnholm, where bearers of despised talents from across the kingdom would be gathered and trained. A wall against the depths for generations to come. The crown provides status and non-interference. Turnholm provides the crown with frontiers that will not fall. And so that the chancellor might sleep soundly, Cade made one final proposal, and a collective sigh swept through the hall. He proposed weaving a vein of living stone bearing his signature into the walls of the capital. Not to control the capital. For the opposite. Through this vein, any master of the Circle of Foundations whose teachings he would master would be able to verify that the capital's walls had not been tampered with by his own hand. Transparency instead of an oath. The chancellor remained silent for a very long time. Then, for the first time during the audience, his parchment-like face twitched into something resembling a smirk, and he said that over the past 40 years, people had tried to buy him off with fear, gold, and flattery. But this was the first time with transparency. He said he had brought 3 decrees in his bag to choose from. One about the laboratory, one about exile, and a third, which he had written that night without believing it would ever be needed. He placed the third one on the table. A decree establishing the Order of the Foundation, headed by Cade Valorn, with the perpetual right to Turnholm Fortress. The king's signature was there. The only thing missing was the chancellor's seal, and the chancellor affixed it right there on the table. Then the old man asked to see the Titan up close, and standing for a long time with his head tilted back as he gazed at the sprawling mountain, he suddenly said quietly, and off the record, that in his youth he had dreamed of building bridges, but his life had been spent weaving intrigues instead. Cade replied that one could start building bridges at any age, and suggested that the old man lay the first stone of the future school. The chancellor laid it with his own hands. The commission left 3 days later, taking with them the agreement and the chancellor, who had strangely grown younger. And the order's life began that very morning with its first student. He was the 8-year-old son of a refugee, who, upon an early manifestation of his gift, was found to possess the talent of straightening. which allowed him to straighten only nails. The whole village teased the boy. Cade sat him down in front of him, took a bucket of bent nails, and asked him to demonstrate. The nails straightened perfectly, down to the very last fiber of metal. Cade asked Dolan how much a perfect nail, one that would never bend or rust in Livingstone, was worth. Dolan did the math and whistled. A month later, the boy's nails were holding up the roofs of the entire new neighborhood. And the boy walked down a street where every roof was, in a small way, his own. Thus was born the first rule of the order, which was carved above the school gates. There is no such thing as a weak talent. There are only talents and places that have not yet found each other. By fall, there were 30 students, fence reinforcers and nail straighteners, and one girl who knew how to make water a little colder and who became the soul of the glacier that saved the autumn supplies. Cedric didn't teach them magic. He taught them what he himself had learned. That power without those you protect is just noise. And on the first night of fall, Cade stood on the wall and listened to the depths out of old habit. And the depths were silent, just as they had been all summer. But the memory of the foundation within him was not silent. 7 hearths. And the farthest of them, according to the builder's memory, lay beneath the western sea, where the kingdom's port cities once stood. That summer, a letter had arrived from the west, from the governor there, a routine one, about grain prices. Between the lines, the governor mentioned that fishermen were complaining about a rumbling from the seabed and that the fish were staying away from the shores. Cade reread the letter 3 times. A rumbling from the seabed. He looked westward, where the sea lay beyond the hills, a week's journey away, and told the wall that their vacation had turned out to be a long one. Chancellor Ton arrived to decide Cade's fate, but accepted his deal and signed a decree establishing the order to found a school for despised talents with the perpetual right of turn home, and transparency through the vein of Livingstone in the capital had replaced oaths. The order began its work with the first rule, that there are no weak talents, and recruited 30 students, including a boy who could straighten nails. The memory of the Foundation knows of 7 sleeping devourers, and news arrived from the west of a rumbling from the seabed near the port cities. Cade did not travel west in either the fall or the winter, and that was the hardest decision of the year. An impulse demanded that he saddle his horse. The memory of the Foundation demanded otherwise. The builders did not perish because they were weak. They perished because each hotbed was met by a single master, and the hotbeds took them one by one. Cade wrote a detailed letter to the governor of the West, describing the signs of the depths awakening and requesting that the rumble be measured monthly. The reply confirmed his assessment. The rumble was there, but it was growing slowly. By all measures of memory, the Western Devourer was merely turning over in its sleep. Years remained before its emergence. And years were precisely the stuff of which things are built. And Cade began to build as he had never built before. Not walls. People. The next 3 years were recorded in the Order's chronicles as a series of major milestones. The first milestone. The second group of students is already traveling to turn home on their own, from all corners of the kingdom, because the rumor of a place where mockery turns into destiny outpaces any decree. Among the arrivals was a sullen girl named Tessa, with the talent Rust Delay. A talent that had been mocked by the entire port city, yet within a year she was safeguarding the Order's entire iron supply. And within 2 years she had derived the formula for eternal bindings for Livingstone. Second snapshot. Cade passes on the circle for the first time. Not knowledge of the circle, but the circle itself. The 5th-level cathedral stone allows an apprentice to be woven into the resonance of the walls, and the best of the first cohort, one by one, hear the stone for themselves. By the end of the second year, there are 11 Livingstone masters in the kingdom, and each has their own outpost under construction on their respective frontiers. Third scene. The Titan. Sonya rises from her 3-year slumber because Cade finally solves the riddle of the core to the end, and the siege weapon receives its first creative task in its eternal life. The mountain digs and carries and tamps down, and in a single summer lays an embankment road through the wastelands from Turnholm to the dead city below. where the order now descends as if to a library. Fourth scene. Cedric departs for the capital as the Order's first ambassador, and the former Academy snob proves to be a natural diplomat because he knows from the inside both the value of power and the cost of mockery. By the end of the third year, the Order was standing on its own 2 feet, feet that would have sufficed even without Cade, and Cade was honestly convinced of this. He withdrew from all decision-making for half a year under the pretext of working in the Dead City, and the Order didn't bat an eye. Outposts were being built. Students were studying. Chancellor Tan sent his grandchildren to Turnholm for the summer. Then Cade announced to the Order's council what he had been preparing for 3 years: the Western Campaign. Not a defensive campaign. For the first time in the entire history of the conflict with the Depths, a campaign to strike at the source before it awakens. The plan was based on everything he had learned from the first Devourer. The creature strikes the defender when their resolve has matured, and the defender is locked within their shell. This meant they had to approach the creature themselves, with a resolve that had already overfed one of its throats, and with a lesson that had cost the people of the Foundation their world. The Council approved the campaign. In the spring of the 4th year, a column unlike any the world had ever seen set out westward. Leading the way was a Titan, carrying a dismantled, trapping citadel on his back. Behind him were 12 masters of Livingstone, 100 senior apprentices. Bram, gray-haired as snow but as unyielding as his crossbow. And Cronenberg's regiment, which the Lord Marshal had wrested from the crown, declaring that he had no intention of letting such a thing slip by a second time. The port city of Westmer met the column with eyes empty of fear. The rumbling from the seabed, which had been growing louder over the past 3 years, could now be heard without any measurements. The fish had vanished completely. At night, the water in the roadstead glowed. The governor, who had aged 10 years and 3, clutched at Cade's arm and was momentarily unable to speak. The work took all summer and took shape as it was assembled. First cut. The Order's master craftsmen are raising a ring of Livingstone from the shore, out into the sea, encircling the bay while Tessa covers the underwater masonry with her stainless script. Second cut. A Titan standing chest-deep in the sea pounds the seabed to the rhythm marked out by Cade. That very same rhythm of the chaser's chained pillar, which the Foundation's memory had deciphered as a feeding signal. Bait. Third cut. At the bottom of the cove, deep within the bedrock, Cade and 12 master craftsmen are building a fortress, twice the size of Turnholm's, and its cathedral-like sturdiness flows into it from 12 sources rather than just one. Fourth cut. Westmer, evacuated to the distant hills, watches at night as the bay glows and prays to all the gods at once. The Western Devourer answered the call at the end of summer. He was younger than the first, and greedier and more foolish, because he lacked millennia of experience. He walked into the underwater trap at the feeding signal, like a catfish into a trap. What followed was what they already knew how to do. A simultaneous reverse discharge by 12 masters. 11,000 cathedral units down his throat. The sea above the bay rose like a hump, and then subsided. The rumble fell silent. Forever. There were no casualties at all, and this shook Cade more than the victory itself. The first stronghold had cost a 100-day siege and the brink of destruction. The second one was taken in a single summer of work, the kind of work they were used to. The difference was called the Order. That fall in Westmere, they laid the foundation for a second school, and the liberated power of the Western outpost did not rest with a single person, but was distributed among the 12 masters as an equal inheritance. Cade stood on the pier and watched the fishing gulls returning to the bay, fishing boats returning to the cove. Bram, standing nearby, was packing his pipe and said without looking that 5 hearthholds were still dormant. Cade replied that now it was a matter not of survival, but of scheduling. Bram grunted and remarked that he was hearing the words of a man who had finally built something that could not be destroyed. Cade remained silent. He was thinking about something he had not yet spoken of to anyone. The Foundation's memory, at the very bottom behind all 7 hearths, held an image as vague as a shadow beneath a shadow.
That which burrows did not come into being on its own. The seven devourers were a brood, and a brood implied a source. And the builder's memory referred to this source by a single word that evoked not hunger, but the chill of design: the gardener. For 3 years, Cade built the Order instead of going on a campaign or raising 12 masters of living stone, establishing a network of outposts, and giving the Titan Sona creative work, while Cedric became an ambassador to the capital.
The Western campaign toward the Awakening Hearth near Westmer proceeded without a single loss. The Devourer was lured into an underwater trap with a feeding signal and destroyed by the combined assault of the 12 masters. 5 dormant embers remain, but the memory of the Foundation preserves the image of their common source, known as the Gardener. The Order spent 12 years extinguishing the 5 remaining embers, and the chronicles have preserved them as a brief sequence. The southern one, beneath the salt marshes, was taken in the 6th year by the combined forces of the Westmer School students alone. Cade did not command that campaign, but remained in reserve, and this was his personal victory. The 2 eastern twins, beneath the mountain roots, took 4 years and cost the Order its first casualties. Master Jorgen and 3 elders were laid to rest in the living stone of the eastern outpost, and instead of tombstones, lighthouses were erected above them. The 5th hearth beneath the northern ice turned out to be dead from old age, and its empty shell was converted into a distant observatory of the depths.
The 6th, the deepest one, located directly beneath Verkelom, the capital, was extinguished over 5 years using the full might of the Order. And in the year it was extinguished, Chancellor Tan died of simple old age, having managed to see from his window as the rumble beneath the city he had guarded his entire life faded away. By the end of the 12th year, the depths were silent everywhere.
And then came what Cade had been waiting for 20 years. Not an attack, an invitation. On the night of the winter solstice, all the veins of living stone in the kingdom, from Turnholm to Westmer, resounded at once in a single harmonious tone, like strings under a stranger's bow. And in that tone, there was no threat, but a question posed in the language of the builders themselves.
The gardener was asking permission to speak. The conversation took place where it all began, at the bottom of the first well near Turnholm. Cade descended alone because the tone was calling him specifically. At the bottom, a figure of living stone, shaped by the depths like a mirror, rose from the rock to meet him, his own silhouette in the gray light. There was no voice. There was a transmission from stone to stone. And in the hour of that transmission, Cade learned the workings of the world down to its very depths. The gardener was not a monster. The gardener was the last of a people who had lived in the world before the founding people, who had once built it themselves and who had themselves been devoured by their own creation. The Devourers were originally a tool, sanitizers of the depths, created to digest what had been destroyed and return its power to the cycle. But the tool outlived its creators, ran wild, and began to devour the living and the ripe. The gardener, the last of his kind, locked away in the heart of the world for thousands of years, did the only thing he could. He sent the feral brood to the outskirts, far from the heart, and raised on the surface those who could slay the brood. Titans who drove the beasts toward the walls. The drivers. The very ladder of attacks perfectly calibrated so that the defender would grow, but not break. For 20 years, all of this had been the gardener's garden, and Cade was his harvest. Cade stood before the mirror image, waiting for anger to rise within him, but the anger did not come. Something else came instead. Recognition. He himself had been doing the same thing for 20 years. He set his students against carefully calibrated trials. He raised defenders through measured suffering. The only difference was that his students knew. He asked the figure, point blank, why this conversation was happening now. The answer was simple. The brood is dead. The gardener's work is done. He asks the one he raised for one thing: permission to die. For thousands of years, only his unfinished task had kept him in the heart of the world. But now the task is done, and he wants to leave. Yet one cannot simply leave the heart of the world. His death without a successor would leave the depths without a master, and in 1,000 years, a new feral brood would take root there.
The heart of the world needs a new gardener. Cade remained silent at the bottom of the well for a very long time.
He thought of Turnholm above him, where Martha was no longer cooking, but merely directing her granddaughters at the cauldrons. About Brahma, who last fall was laid to rest in the living stone of the northern wall at his own request, saying that no better grave could be built for a soldier. About Cedric, whose son had entered the third circle this year. About the 30 outposts and 4 schools, and about the fact that the Order had long since had no need for Cade Valorn to stand guard. He asked one last question. Could the gardener of the heart of the world ascend? The mirrored figure replied that the heart of the world is no prison for one who knows how to walk through stone. It was a prison for the lone gardener. But the new gardener would have something up there that the old one did not. 12 masters who could hear him through any thickness. Schools. Heirs. A garden that grows on its own. Cade climbed out of the well at dawn, convened the Grand Council of the Order, and told them everything without holding anything back, as had been the custom since the first council. He said he was going down, not forever, but deeper. That the connection through the living stone would remain, and that once a year at the winter solstice, he would ascend on his own. The council listened, and the Tessa, on behalf of everyone, replied briefly. The Order was allowing the founder to take the bypass because the bypass was the work of a defender, and the work of a defender was respected here. The farewell felt less like a funeral and more like a working gathering, and that was exactly as it should be. Cade walked around Turnholm in a single day. He stood by the wall where Bram slept in the gray light. He ruffled the nape of Sonia's giant muzzle and ordered Gore to obey Tessa. He ate a rye bread roll by Martha's cauldrons, and in the evening, before the eyes of the entire town, he approached that very first wall he had reinforced as a 16-year-old on that first evening, stepped into it, and the wall accepted him like water. Down below in the heart of the world, the old gardener was waiting at his post. The transfer took an instant and an eternity. Then, the last of the ancient people dissolved into a gray light, with that feeling he had forgotten over thousands of years and only now remembered, and that feeling was peace. Cade Valorn took his post at the heart of the world and pressed his palms against its walls. And he heard everything. Every outpost, every school, every house with living walls where children who didn't know the word siege went to sleep. 30 years ago, the Academy Auditorium had laughed at a talent fit only for stroking walls. The auditorium was right in its own way. That was all he'd done his whole life. It's just that no one in that auditorium knew what walls could be like. Walls of stone. Walls of people. And the very last wall, which cannot be destroyed because it holds not from the outside but from the inside. The world stood upon it, and the world could sleep peacefully. The defender was at his post. Over the course of 12 years, the Order extinguished all 5 remaining hotbeds, after which the gardener, the last of the people of the predecessors, revealed to Cade that his entire journey had been the cultivation of a destroyer, of a feral brood of devourers, and asked permission to die, passing on the post of Master of the Depths. Cade accepted the role of gardener of the heart of the world, maintaining a connection with the Order through the living stone and the right to ascend to the surface. The story came full circle. The once despised fence builder became an eternal defender, holding the world together from within, while his order of schools and outposts continues his work on the surface. Cade did not travel west, neither in the fall nor in the winter, and this was the most difficult decision of the year. His impulse demanded that he saddle his horse immediately. The memory of the Foundation demanded otherwise. The builders did not perish because they were weak. They were stronger than anyone alive today. They perished because each hearth was met by a single master with his fortress, and the hearths took them one by one, century after century. Cade wrote a detailed letter to the governor of the West, describing the signs of the depths awakening and requesting that the rumble be measured monthly through the wells and the readings relayed by carrier pigeon. The reply confirmed his calculations. The rumble was there, but it grew as slowly as a tree. By all measures of memory,
The Western devourer was merely turning in its sleep, and years remained before its emergence. And years were precisely the stuff of which things are built. And Cade began to build as he had never built before. Not walls. People. The next 3 years were recorded in the Order's chronicles as a series of major phases. The first phase. The second group of students travels to Turnholm on their own, without recruiters, from all corners of the kingdom, because the rumor of a place where mockery turns into destiny outpaces any decree. Parents who just yesterday were hiding their children with unconventional talents from their neighbors' eyes are now bringing them halfway across the kingdom. Among the arrivals is a sullen girl named Tessa SSA from a port city. With the talent Rust Delay, a talent her entire street had mocked, and which her father called a curse more useless than freckles. A year later, Tessa safeguards the Order's entire iron stockpile. 2 years later, she devises the formula for eternal bindings for Livingstone. 3 years later, her runic script lies at the foundation of every outpost, and her father comes to Turnholm to ask for forgiveness. Tessa forgives him because by that time, the entire kingdom knows by heart the Order's first rule, carved above the school gates. There are no weak talents. There are only talents and places that have not yet found each other. Second cut. Cade passes on the circle for the first time. Not knowledge of the circle, but the circle itself. The 5th-level cathedral stone allows him to weave a student into the resonance of the walls and channel his gift through the veins, just as he once channeled Cedric's flame. The first to hear the stone was the nail-straightening boy, who had grown into a broad-shouldered young man. He wept, standing with his palms pressed against the wall, because the wall had answered him. Then Tessa heard it. Then 9 more from the first group. By the end of the 2nd year in the kingdom, there were 11 masters of the living stone, not counting Cade himself, and each had their own outpost under construction on their respective frontiers. Cade shuttles between the outposts directly through the bedrock, and his underground journeys become a legend told around campfires. Third cut, the Titan. Sonya rises from her 3-year slumber because Cade has finally solved the riddle of the core once and for all. A siege weapon needs no orders. The siege weapon needs a load worthy of its architecture. Cade gives the core the image of a road, and the mountain receives its first creative task in its eternal life. The Titan digs, carries, and tamps down the earth, and in a single summer lays a causeway through the wastelands from Turnholm to the pass above the dead city, where the Order now descends as if to a library. The masters read the walls of the people of the Foundation with their palms, and each descent brings new techniques. The children of Turnholm wave to the Titan from the crest of the wall as the mountain passes by. And one day, the mountain stops and very carefully tilts the front edge of its armor in response. And from that day on, the entire North is in love with this monster. Fourth cut. Cedric departs for the capital as the Order's first ambassador. The former Academy snob turns out to be a natural-born diplomat because he knows from the inside both the value of power and the cost of mockery. And he knows how to speak to the arrogant because he remembers who he once was. He secures a law from the crown protecting those with rare talents. And throughout the kingdom, the circuses where such people were put on display for money are shut down. By the end of the 3rd year, the Order was standing on its own 2 feet. It would have managed even without Cade. And Cade was honestly convinced of this. He stepped back from all decision-making for half a year under the pretext of working in a ghost town, and the Order didn't flinch. Outposts were being built according to the schedules of Finch, who had risen to become the Order's chancellor, and his records now served as the foundation of life. The students were studying. Chancellor Tan sent his grandchildren to Turnholm for the summer, and they returned to the capital with calluses from the stone and stories that left the court speechless. Then Cade announced to the Order's council what he had been preparing for 3 years: the Western Campaign. Not a defensive one. For the first time in the entire history of the conflict with the depths, a campaign to strike at the source before it awoke.
He spoke to the council while standing, and the campaign map hung behind him, covering the entire wall. The plan was based on everything he had learned from the first devourer. The creature strikes the defender when their resolve has ripened, while the defender is locked within their shell, clinging to what they have accumulated. So we must go to the creature ourselves, with resilience that has already overfed one maw, with a trap the creature will mistake for prey,
And with a lesson that cost the people of the Foundation their world. Never face the depths alone.
Bram listened from the front row. And when Cade finished, the old man stood up and told the council that he had spent 40 years fighting on the retreat, and the last few years standing still. And now, before his death, he wanted to know what it was like to fight on the offensive. The council unanimously approved the campaign. In the spring of the 4th year, a column unlike any the world had ever seen set out westward. Leading the way was a Titan, carrying on his back a disassembled, trapping citadel, stacked in blocks according to Finch's specifications. Behind him were 12 masters of living stone in the gray cloaks of the order. 100 senior apprentices. Bram, his hair as white as snow, but as unyielding as his crossbow. And Cronenberg's regiment, which the Lord Marshal had wrested from the crown by declaring to the War Council that he had no intention of letting such a thing slip by a second time, and let them try to stop him. Entire villages along the way poured out onto the road. Mothers lifted their children into their arms so they might remember the advancing mountain and the people leading it, just as herders lead an ox. The port city of Westmer greeted the column with eyes empty of fear. Over the past 3 years, the rumbling from the seabed had become audible without any special equipment, simply by pressing one's ear to the cobblestones. The fish had vanished entirely, and the fishing fleet was rotting at the docks. At night, the water in the roadstead glowed with a murky, whitish light, and the old men said the sea had come to resemble an eye with a cataract. The governor, who had aged 10 years and 3, clutched Cade's arm with both hands and couldn't speak at first. When he finally could, he asked only whether they had made it in time. Cade replied that they had made it with time to spare, and that they would use that extra time to ensure no one died. The work took the entire summer and proceeded according to plan. First cut. The Order's masters are building a ring of living stone from the shore out into the sea, encircling the bay, and Tessa spends her days waist-deep in the water, covering the underwater masonry with her stainless script. In the evenings, she warms herself by the fire and gazes at her creation with the face of someone who has found their place. Second shot. Standing chest-deep in the sea, the Titan pounds out the rhythm marked by Cade onto the seabed. That very same rhythm of the chaser's chained pillar, which the Foundation's memory has deciphered as a feeding signal. Bait. The sound travels into the depths of the water and the depths of the seabed, and somewhere below, a slumbering greed begins to stir at the familiar call. Third cut. At the bottom of the bay, deep within the bedrock, Cade and 12 masters are building a fishing citadel twice the size of the one at Turnholm, and its cathedral-like sturdiness flows into it from 12 sources rather than just one. And for the first time in years, Cade feels not the weight of the burden, but the lightness of a shared load. Fourth scene. Westmer, evacuated to the distant hills, watches at night as the bay glows, no longer a white spot, but with the even gray light of living stone, and prays to all the gods at once, while the children of the hills play at being masters of the order and fight for the right to be Cade. The Western Devourer came at the call at the end of summer. He was younger than the first, and greedier and more foolish, because he lacked millennia of experience and had never once encountered resistance. He walked into the underwater trap at the feeding signal like a catfish into a trap. The estuary opened like a ready-made throat and began to inhale. What followed was what they already knew how to do. A simultaneous reverse discharge by 12 masters at a command that Cade gave with a single strike of his palm against a rock. 11,000 cathedral units into the throat in a single stream. The sea above the cove rose into a hump as tall as a bell tower and crashed down in white foam. The roar fell silent. Forever. There were absolutely no casualties, and this shook Cade more than the victory itself. He stood on the pier, scanning his men with his eyes again and again, and all were alive and not even wounded. The first stronghold had cost a 100-day siege and the brink of destruction. The second was taken in a single summer's work, just as one takes on a job. The difference was called the Order.
That fall in Westmere, they laid the foundation for the second school of the foundation, and the governor set aside the city's finest building for it. And the freed strength of the western outpost did not fall on a single person, but was divided equally among 12 masters as an inheritance, and no one buckled under its weight because the burden had been shared in advance. Cade stood on the pier and watched the fishing boats returning to the cove and the first fishing sail in 4 years leaving the harbor. Bram, standing nearby, was packing his pipe and said without looking up that 5 hearths were still dormant. Cade replied that now it was a matter not of survival, but of schedule. Bram grunted and remarked that he was hearing the words of a man who had finally built something that could not be destroyed. Cade remained silent. He was thinking about something he had not yet told anyone. The foundation's memory, at the very bottom behind all 7 hearths, held an image as vague as a shadow beneath a shadow. That which burrows did not come into being on its own. The 7 devourers were a brood from a single clutch, scattered to the ends of the world. And a brood implied a source. And the builder's memory referred to this source with a single word that evoked not hunger, but the chill of design. The gardener. For 3 years, Cade built the Order instead of going on a campaign, training 12 masters of Livingstone, including Tessa, who possessed a talent for resisting rust, and assigning the Titan Sona the creative task of laying the tract, while Cedric became an ambassador who secured a law protecting rare talents. The Western campaign against the hotbed near Westmere proceeded without a single loss. The Devourers were lured by a feeding signal into an underwater trap and destroyed by a combined assault of 12 masters, and the hotbed's power was dispersed equally among them all. 5 dormant hotbeds remain, but the memory of the Foundation preserves the image of their common source, known as the Gardener. The Order spent 12 years extinguishing the 5 remaining hubs, and the Chronicles have preserved these years as a series of campaigns, each of which taught its own lesson. The southern hub near the salt marshes was taken in the 6th year by the students of the Westmere School alone, under the command of a now-matured boy, the Straightener, who had become Master Gvozd, and Kaid did not command that expedition, but stood in reserve behind a hill and did not intervene even once. And this was his personal victory, greater than the hearth itself. The 2 eastern twins beneath the mountain's roots took 4 years and cost the Order its first casualties. The twins hunted as a pair, and when the first one walked into the trap, the second struck from the side through the rock at the standing masters. Master Jorgen managed to form a wall and take the blow upon himself along with 4 senior apprentices. 3 of the 4 fell alongside him. The trap worked, and the second twin walked into it after the first, drawn by the scent of their shared death, and was devoured like the rest, though the price paid was a true one. No tombstones were erected over the fallen. They were incorporated into the living stone of the eastern outpost according to a rite that arose of its own accord, and since then the outpost walls have glowed at night with an even, warm light. Travelers made their way toward this light across the mountain passes, and no one was afraid. Thus the Order learned that its dead continued to hold the line. The 5th hearth beneath the northern ice turned out to be dead from old age, and its empty shell was lined from the inside over the course of 3 years, transforming it into a distant observatory of the depths, from which young masters now listened to the depths of the world for months on end. The 6th, the deepest, lay beneath Verkholm itself, the capital, and it took 5 years to extinguish it with the full might of the Order, for a single mistake would have cost 1,000,000 lives. In the year of its extinguishing, Chancellor Morius Tien died of simple old age in his office, having just received word that the rumbling beneath the city had ceased. He was found in the morning by the window overlooking the city wall, where a gray vein of living stone, which he had once accepted in place of an oath, ran through it. The entire capital mourned him, and the Order carried the coffin in the lead in accordance with the Chancellor's own will. By the end of the 12th year, the depths were silent everywhere. For the first time in the history the stone could remember,
And then came what Cade had been waiting for 20 years. Not an attack, an invitation. On the night of the winter solstice, all the veins of the kingdom's living stone, from Turnholm to Westmere, from the northern observatory to the capital's wall, resounded at once in a single harmonious tone, like strings under a stranger's bow. The masters at all the outposts awoke simultaneously, pressed their palms against the walls, and heard the same thing. There was no contain a threat. It was a question posed in the language of the builders themselves, with impeccable, old-fashioned courtesy. The gardener was asking permission to speak. The conversation took place where it all began, at the bottom of the first well near Turnholm. Cade descended alone because the tone had called specifically for him, and the Order's council had released him after a night of debate, having taken his word that the veins would be opened and the master builders would hear every word of the stone. At the bottom, a figure of living stone, shaped by the depths like a mirror, rose from the rock to meet him. His own life-size silhouette cast in gray light down to the very last feature of his face. There was no voice. There was a transmission from stone to stone, dense as compressed ages. And in the hour of that transmission, Cade learned the structure of the world down to its very depths. The gardener was no monster. The gardener was the last of a people who had lived in the world before the founding people, who had once built the cities of the depths themselves, and who had been devoured by their own creation. The devourers were originally tools, sanitizers of the depths, created to digest what was destroyed and dead, and to return the bound power to the world's cycle. As useful as fire. And like fire, they outlived their creators, ran wild, began to devour the living and the ripe, and devoured their own people down to the last one. Except for one. The gardener, the last of his kind, locked away in the heart of the world for thousands of years, did the only thing a gardener could do. He could not kill the brood himself because he was its creator, and the brood would not let him near. He banished the feral ones to the farthest reaches, away from the heart of the world. And on the surface, he raised one who could slay the brood, the Titans, who drove the beasts toward the walls of the Chosen. The drivers who kept the rhythm of the sieges. The very sequence of attacks on Turnholm was perfectly calibrated so that the defender would grow but not break. First the hounds, then the horde, then the magic, then the Titan. Each stage came when Cade was ready to withstand it, and not a day sooner. All of this, for 20 years, had been the gardener's garden, and Cade was his harvest.
And the people of the Foundation, 1,000 years ago, had been the same kind of harvest that hadn't had time to ripen, because back then, the gardener hadn't yet learned how to measure out misfortune. Cade stood before his mirror image, waiting for anger to well up within him, but the anger didn't come. Something else came instead. Recognition. He himself had been doing the very same thing for 20 years. He had set his students against carefully calibrated trials. He had nurtured defenders through measured hardship. He had sent Gavazdi to the southern stronghold, knowing that he would succeed, but without telling him so in advance. The difference lay in just one thing, and Cade voiced it plainly, stone upon stone. His students knew they were being nurtured. The gardener's harvest did not. The mirrored figure accepted the rebuke without objection and replied that this was precisely why he was asking rather than taking. Cade asked directly why they were having this conversation now. The answer was simple and immense. The brood is dead. The gardener's work is done. He asks one thing of those he has raised, permission to die. For thousands of years, only his unfinished business had kept him in the heart of the world. Now the work is done, and he is worn down to the last thread and wishes to leave. But one cannot simply leave the heart of the world. The heart of the world is not a place but a position. Through it, the entire depth breathes, and without a master, within 1,000 years a new feral brood will take root there, born of the same sanitary principles as the previous one. The heart of the world needs a new gardener, and for the first time in the history of the world, there is a candidate who knows about the position in advance and can refuse it. Cade remained silent at the bottom of the well for a very long time, and above,
12 masters listened to his silence through the veins, and no one dared to interrupt. He thought of Turnholm overhead, where Martha was no longer cooking, but merely commanding her granddaughters by the cauldrons, and her little hunchback lay there, dried up in his travel bag, for 20 years. About Brahma, who last fall asked to be accepted into the living stone of the northern wall, and went there fully conscious with his pipe, saying that no better grave could be built for a soldier, and that now he was finally in century. About Cedric, whose son entered the third circle this year, and whose daughter straightened not nails, but the backs of the hunchbacks, and whose talent was once also called useless. About the 30 outposts and 4 schools, and about how the Order has long since had no need for Cade Valorn to stand guard, and how he had consciously built up that uselessness for 12 years. He asked one last question. Can the gardener of the heart of the world ascend? The mirrored figure replied that the heart of the world is no prison for one who knows how to walk through stone. It was a prison for the gardener, a loner who had lost everyone who could hear him. But the new gardener above would have what the old one never had. 12 masters who could hear him through any thickness. Schools where his rule was carved above the gates. Heirs. A garden that grows on its own and needs no secrecy. Cade climbed out of the well at dawn, convened the Order's Grand Council, and told them everything without holding anything back, just as had been the custom since the very first council in the unfinished citadel. He said he was going down, not forever, but deeper. That he was accepting this post not as a sacrifice, but as a job, because it was the same work he'd been doing his whole life. Only now the wall would be deeper. That the connection through the living stone would remain open forever, and that once a year, at the winter solstice, he would come up himself to eat some soup and check the masonry. The council listened in silence, and Master Tessa stood up and replied briefly on behalf of everyone.
The Order is releasing the Founder to the bypass because the bypass is the work of a defender, and the work of a defender is respected here more than anything else in the world. And let those below know that those above now know how to build as well. And if in 1,000 years the depths need help again, the depths know where to turn. The farewell felt less like a funeral and more like a working gathering. And that was exactly as it should be.
Cade walked around Turnholm in a single day. He stood by the northern wall where Bram stood his eternal guard in the warm gray light and placed his palm against it. The wall responded with something very much like the grunt of an old soldier. He ruffled the nape of Sonia's gigantic muzzle and ordered the mountain to obey Tess, and the mountain tilted the front edge of its shell just as that very first time in front of the children. He ate a piece of rye bread by Martha's cauldrons, and the old woman blessed him for the journey like a little child, and she didn't cry because she had promised herself not to. He went into the school where a first-grade class was in session and sat on the back bench among the 7-year-olds, and none of them recognized in the quiet, gray man the person their textbook was about. And in the evening, in full view of the entire town, he approached that very first wall he had reinforced as a 16-year-old on his first night here. He ran his hand over the stone that remembered the rotten palisade, and he stepped into the wall, and the wall accepted him as water accepts a swimmer, and a gray light swept across all of Turnholm's fortifications, from the gates to the last house, like a long exhalation. Down below, in the heart of the world, the old gardener waited at his post. The transmission took an instant and an eternity at once. Then the last of the ancient people dissolved into gray light with a feeling he had completely forgotten over thousands of years and remembered only at the very end, and that feeling was the peace of a job well done. Cade Valorn took his post at the heart of the world and pressed his palms against its walls. And he heard everything, every outpost from the southern salt flats to the northern ice. Every school where a bell would ring in the morning. Every lighthouse rising above those who had fallen in the east. Every house with living walls where children went to sleep, children who didn't know the word siege and would never learn it. 30 years ago, the Academy Hall had laughed at a talent fit only for smoothing walls, and the priest, with weary pity, had predicted a life of repairing fences for him. The hall was right in its own way, and the priest was right in his own way. That was all he had ever done his whole life. He smoothed walls and repaired fences. It's just that no one in that auditorium knew what walls could really be like. Walls of stone that grow to meet the blow, walls of people that hold firmer than stone, walls of memory in which the dead stand guard alongside the living, and the very last wall, deeper than all the others, which no battering ram could destroy, because it holds the world not from the outside, but from the inside. The world stood upon it, and the world could sleep peacefully. The defender was at his post, and that was enough. Over the course of 12 years, the Order extinguished all 5 hotbeds, paying the price with the early losses of Master Jorgen and his apprentices, who had been incorporated into the living stone of the outpost, while Chancellor Tan died upon witnessing the silence beneath the capital. The gardener, the last of the people of the forebears, revealed to Keed that his entire journey had been the cultivation of a destroyer, a feral brood of orderlies of the depths, and asked permission to die, passing on the position of master of the heart of the world. Cade accepted the position as the work of a defender, maintaining his connection to the Order and the right to ascend. The story came full circle. The despised fence builder became an eternal wall, holding the world together from within, while his Order, the school of the outpost and his heirs, continue the work on the surface,